The lamp is lit, the room is warm, and there is nowhere at all you need to be for the next long while. So let your shoulders come down away from your ears, and let your breath go slow and even, and let the whole of the day you have just finished slide off you the way a heavy coat slides off at the door. Because tonight we are going to begin, very gently, out on the water in the dark, a long time ago, and we are going to begin there, because that is where a great many people first meet the man whose whole long life we are going to walk through together, out on the black tide water of a wide American river in the smallest hours of a September night. And I want you to picture it now. Not sharply, not with any effort, but softly, the way a scene forms behind your eyes as you are drifting off. The great river the people there called the Hudson, running down toward the sea between its dark hills, and the water lying almost still and almost black under a thin scattering of stars, and moving out upon that black water a single small rowboat, a plain thing, oars muffled, dipping and pulling, carrying its handful of men downstream through the quiet toward a ship that waits below in the deeper channel. A British warship, a sloop of war, riding at anchor with her lanterns low, and her name, which is a strange and fitting name to hold in the mind at the start of a story like this one, was the Vulture. And in that little boat, wrapped against the river chill, sat a heavy-set man in the fine blue and buff coat of an American general, a man of about 40, broad through the chest, with a soldier's hard-used body and a soldier's ruined leg, and he was being rowed, stroke by careful stroke, away from the fort he commanded, and away from the army he had bled for, and away from the country he had helped to make, and away, though he could not have said it in so many words, from every single thing that he had ever been, out toward the dark hull of that waiting ship and the other life that lay on the far side of it. And we are going to leave him there, for now, just there, suspended on the black water between the shore he is leaving and the ship he is going to, because we are not ready yet to know how he came to be in that boat, and there is no hurry at all to find out, none whatsoever, and so we will simply hold him there, a soft dark shape on the soft dark river, a man being rowed quietly out of his own good name and into a word that would outlast him by centuries, and we will pull the gaze back from him now, up and away, the way the eye lifts from a single candle to take in the whole quiet room, and we will let that river and that boat and that waiting ship grow small and grow still and turn into a kind of picture hanging in the dark, and we will begin instead at the true beginning, which is where all of us begin, with a small child in a small town in a world that is already almost 300 years gone, because that is the way we will do this, slowly and kindly and all the way through, from the very first breath to the very last, and you do not need to hold on to any of it. You do not need to remember a single name or a single date or a single battle. You can let every fact I give you slip straight through your fingers like warm water, because I will keep the thread of it for you the whole way, and the man will still be here, whether you are awake at the end of it or have long since sailed off into your own sleep, and either of those is entirely, completely all right. So wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever bed or whatever chair, in whatever town or country, near or far, let the day go now. Let it be finished. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, and no problem waiting for you tonight that will not keep just as well until the morning, and the lamp will burn as long as you need it to, low and steady and patient beside you, and all you have to do, the only task left to you in the whole wide world at this hour, is to breathe and to rest, and to let these old soft words move over you like a current, while a life unspools gently in the dark. And there is one plain question I want to lay down at the very start before we go back to the cradle. One question that we will carry with us all the long way through this life. Not to trouble you with it, but almost the opposite. To give the walk its quiet shape. And here it is, as plainly as I can set it down. How does a man give a country his leg, and then turn around and try to sell it his soul? For that is the strange doubled thing at the centre of this life. And it is no exaggeration and no trick of speech. It is only the truth of what happened, that this same heavy man in the little boat once poured out his own blood for the cause he was now being rowed away from, that he was. Before he was anything else, one of its bravest soldiers, a man who led from the front and was shot down in the very hour of victory and shattered the bone of his leg for the sake of that young country, gave it, quite literally, the use of his leg, so that he walked with a limp and a shortened, aching stride for the rest of his days as the price of his courage. And yet this same man, some years on, sat down in secret and set about handing the enemy the keys to the very heart of that country, its great river fortress, its river, very nearly its whole cause, for money and for rank and for the soothing of some deep private wound, and so his name, which had once meant courage, came instead to mean the opposite of loyalty, came to be, in the language of his own people ever after, simply another word for a traitor. And the question of how those two men can be the same man, how the hero and the turncoat can share one body and one heart, is not a question that can be answered with a gasp, or with a single dramatic scene, or with one villain's speech in the dark, and I am not going to try to answer it that way, because I do not think it can be answered that way, and because that is not what this quiet hour is for. I am going to try to answer it the only way I think it can honestly be answered, which is slowly, across a whole life, from the beginning, gently, watching the grain of the wood before we ever come to the place where it splits, and so let us leave the boat and the river and the waiting ship hanging there in the dark behind us. And let us go all the way back past the wars and the wound and the fame, back through all of it, to a small town in the American colonies, on a cold morning in the middle of winter, to a house where a baby is being born. And the place we come down into is called Norwich in Connecticut, a tidy New England town of white houses and meeting house steeples and wharves, set where three small rivers run down toward the sea, a serious church-going place of merchants and sea captains and ministers, and the year is 1741, the 14th of January, deep in the New England winter, when the ground is iron-hard and the smoke stands straight up into a pale cold sky. And into that cold morning a boy is born to a family named Arnold, and they give him a name already heavy with meaning, Benedict, after his own father, and through his father after a much grander Benedict Arnold before him, his great-grandfather, an early colonial governor of Rhode Island, a founder and a man of weight in the first rough generations of English life in that new land. So the name laid on this small boy was an inheritance, a proud old family name that had once sat in a governor's chair, settling now like a coat much too big across the shoulders of a very small child. And I want you to hold that gently, because it matters more than almost anything to what is coming. The weight of a proud name laid on a boy who would grow up watching that same name slide, in his own household, out of pride and down toward shame. For the Arnolds, by the time this Benedict was born, were a family on the way down, and there is a particular ache in that, the ache of a family that remembers being better off than it is, an ache that gets into children as plain poverty never quite does. They had been merchants, and good ones, and the father had come up by his own effort and married well, a widow named Hannah Waterman King, a woman of good family, devout and steady and capable, and for a while the household stood on solid ground. But as the boy grew, the father began to slip, and the thing that took him down was drink, plain and slow, drink and a string of ventures that soured one after another, so that the money thinned and the standing wore away, and the town's respect curdled into pity and then into the low murmur that follows a man once looked up to, and now seen unsteady in the street. And for a proud and sensitive boy, few things cut deeper than the sight of a father falling in the eyes of the neighbours, and that was the weather young Benedict grew up inside of, the slow cold rain of a household coming down in the world. Holding the roof up through all of it was the mother Hannah, by every account the true strength of that home, a woman of deep religious faith, who wrote her son grave and loving letters urging him toward goodness, and who bore a heavier grief still, for she buried, one after another, most of her children. Sickness moved through the colonial towns like a tide no one could hold back, and the yellow fever came again and again for the Arnold children, and took them, one and then another, until of all she brought into the world only 2 lived to grow up, this boy Benedict and one younger sister Hannah, who would love her brother all her life. So picture what that meant for a childhood, that young Benedict grew up as the surviving son, the one the fever passed over, moving through a house and a burying ground that held more small graves than living children, carrying the double burden such children carry, the grief of the lost and the unspoken weight of being the one who was spared. The son on whom all the family's fallen hopes now came to rest, because he was so largely what was left. And out of that soil, a proud sinking family and a devout grieving mother, and a household ringed with small graves, 2 things grew in the boy early, 2 grains pressed deep into the green wood of him that we will see again and again. The first was a fierce, restless, almost hungry physical daring, a need to move and to dare and to be seen doing it, for he was a bold and headlong boy, strong and quick, and afraid of very little, always first onto the thin ice and last off it, and the old stories of his Norwich boyhood, which we should hold loosely, are all of daring exactly this kind, of the boy skating farther than the others on the frozen rivers, and above all the story that has always clung to his name, of the great water wheel of a grist mill turning in the current, and the boy catching hold of it and riding it, clinging to the wet spokes, as the wheel carried him down and under the dark water and up again. Into the light, round and round, for the sheer danger of it, and for the eyes of the other boys on him. And whether it happened just so hardly matters, because the truth it carries is true, that here from the start was a boy who needed to be brave, who needed to be seen to be brave, who reached for danger the way other children reach for comfort, as if some deep place in him could only be quieted by proving over and over that he was not afraid. The second grain, twined all through the first, was a raw and easily stung sensitivity about honour, about the family's fallen standing, a tender and prickly pride that could not bear to be looked down upon, that felt every slight like a splinter under the skin, that had watched a father's good name go soft, and was fiercely determined that his own would not. And you can see already how those 2 grains together, the reckless need to be seen as brave, and the burning inability to bear any insult, might make a boy into a man of enormous courage and enormous touchiness both at once. A man who would give everything for glory and forgive nothing that felt like disrespect. For a while there was schooling, and good schooling too, for his mother's family had the means to see him educated as a gentleman's son, and he was sent to a school in nearby Canterbury, boarding with a minister schoolmaster, learning his letters and his Latin, pointed toward the settled respectable future the old name deserved, perhaps even toward the college at New Haven. But that road closed for the plainest and saddest of reasons, that the money ran out, the father's failures reaching so far that the fees could not be paid, and the boy was brought home, his gentleman's education broken off half-finished. Another door quietly shut by his father's decline. Something had to be found for him to do, and what was found was a trade, and it was found within the family, through his mother's side, the side with the standing still intact, for Hannah had cousins in Norwich named Lathrop, 2 brothers, Daniel and Joshua, prosperous and respected keepers of a thriving apothecary's shop and trading house, men who dealt in medicines but far beyond that too. In fine imported goods, men with ships and ledgers and connections running down the coast and across the sea, men who had precisely the settled honour the Arnolds had lost, and to these cousins, at about 14, young Benedict was bound as an apprentice. And it was there, in that busy shop full of the smell of herbs and camphor and imported tea, that the man he would become was very largely made. For an apprenticeship then was not a job so much as a whole upbringing, years long, in which a boy was given over to a master to be shaped. What the Lathrops gave him was a real trade and a real education in getting on in the world. The apothecary's craft, the mixing and measuring of drugs, the knowledge of what healed and what harmed, and the merchant's craft alongside it. The ledgers, the buying and selling, the judging of goods and of men, and not least they set before him every day, simply by who they were, the bearing and quiet confidence of established men. And the boy watched and learned hungrily, because he wanted that standing and solidity with the whole force of that proud stung heart, wanted to be someday a man like the Lathrops rather than a man like his own poor father, and he worked, and he was good at it, sharp and quick with figures and with people, a natural trader. And yet even in those settling years the restlessness did not lie quiet, for these were the years of the long war between the British colonies and the French for the mastery of the continent, the French and Indian War. And its drums reached even into Norwich, and the boy felt the pull of soldiering in his blood, the pull of danger and of a chance to be brave where it would be seen, and the old tradition, held loosely, is that more than once the young apprentice slipped away toward the militia and the fighting, and then each time thought better of it, or was fetched home and settled again to his trade. So that even here you can see the shape of him forming, the tradesman and the soldier warring in one young body, the ledger and the musket. And while he grew and dreamed of soldiering, the old griefs closed quietly around him, for in 1759 his mother died, Hannah, the steady praying strength of that whole broken house, and it is no small thing to lose such a mother so young, to lose the one fixed steadying point in a life that had known so much sinking, and her going seems to have taken away the last restraint on the father, who fell the rest of the way into drink and disgrace, and 2 years later, in 1761, he too died, and died in that disgrace, his good old name in the dust. So within about 2 years the young man lost both his parents, and was left, at the very threshold of manhood, alone in the world save for his one sister, with no father to lean on, and no mother to steady him, but with something his father had never held, and his mother's people had given him, a trade in his 2 hands, a real and marketable skill learned solidly over long years. And so we can see him whole for the first time, this young man of about 21, hardened by loss and sharpened by work, capable, quick, physically bold, hungry, and above all proud, carrying a fine old name that had been dragged low in his own lifetime, and a fierce private determination to lift it back where it belonged, with both parents in the ground and nothing to hold him in Norwich any longer, and a trade in his hands and the whole wider world open in front of him. And so he gathered up the little he had, mostly the trade in his hands and the pride in his chest, and turned his back on Norwich, on the small graves and the shamed old name, and went out looking for a place to begin again, and the place he chose. Some 30 or 40 miles down the coast was the busy little seaport of New Haven, and there is something quietly moving about a man of 1 or 2 and 20 setting out not merely to make a living, but to make himself, to build with his own 2 hands the very kind of life his father had let slip. New Haven in those years was just the sort of rising, hopeful, salt-aired place where such a thing might be done, a college town with its young men and its books, a harbour town with its wharves and its ships and its cargoes coming and going on the tide, a town on its way up, like the man who came to it. And he set himself up there as an apothecary, the trade he had learned so thoroughly, the powders and tinctures and dried herbs in their labelled drawers, but he did not stop at medicines, because he had learned from the Lathrops that a shrewd merchant sells whatever people wish to buy, and so his shop became a fuller thing than a mere druggist's counter, a place that sold books too, and stationery, and prints, and cloth, and fine imported goods, the little luxuries of a comfortable colonial life, and he stocked it well and kept it handsomely, and over the door he hung a sign painted with 3 Latin words that tell you almost everything about the young man beneath them, Sibi Totique, which means, roughly and beautifully, for himself and for all, and you can turn that little motto over as your breathing slows. Because it is such a revealing thing to choose, that blend of frank self-interest and open generosity, the man who means plainly to look after himself, and yet wishes it understood that in doing so he serves the whole, so that his getting on and the general good are, in his mind, one braided thing, and that knot of self and cause tied so tightly together will run through the whole of the life we are walking tonight, all the way to its far strange end. And the shop did well, because he was good at it, and this is the first plain thing to understand about Benedict Arnold, that whatever else he was, and he was many difficult things. He was genuinely able, genuinely hard-working, genuinely shrewd. A man who could take an empty room and a little credit and make a thriving concern out of it. And it was never enough for him, because the thing that drove him was not comfort but rising. So, having built up the trade on land, he reached for the sea, for the real money in a New England port lay not on the shelves of a shop, but out on the salt water, in the ships that carried the colony's goods down the long Atlantic coast to the rich sugar islands of the West Indies and up to the cold harbours of Canada and back. And Arnold did not merely wish to buy their cargoes. He wished to own the ships, and so he did, buying vessels as his means allowed, and he did not sit ashore like a gentleman merchant. He went to sea himself, learned the working of a ship and the reading of the weather and the handling of men, and became in the plainest sense a sea captain, sailing his own bottoms on his own account. A hard, competent, restless trader who knew the price of everything in every port he touched. He ranged widely, down to the southern colonies, and out to Barbados and the other sugar islands, and up the other way to the St. Lawrence and the docks of Quebec, so that he came to know with a trader's exact knowledge both the sweltering wharves of the Caribbean and the cold stone waterfront of that northern French city. Carrying the honest freight of the age, horses shipped down to the islands, lumber from the northern forests, dry goods and saltfish, and bringing back the rum and sugar and molasses, the whole New England economy was soaked in, and it was a hard, thin-margined trade, always one sunk ship away from ruin, and Arnold ran it boldly, on borrowed money and stretched credit, always reaching further than was strictly safe, because the daring was the whole point, and it made him money and enemies both, and made him for a while exactly the rising figure he had left Norwich determined to become. But a shadow was falling across all this honest trade, not from any storm at sea, but from London, from a crown that after long years of leaving its American colonies to themselves, was beginning to look at them with a harder eye, to see in their busy prosperity a thing to be taxed and squeezed. And here is something to understand gently, if you are to understand why a man like Arnold came in time. To feel about the mother country the way he did, that for most of his trading life the rules of empire had sat lightly, and a great deal of the commerce everyone engaged in, the buying of sugar and molasses from islands that did not fly the British flag, the small evasions of duties no one enforced, had gone on so long and so openly that it did not feel like crime at all. It felt simply like trade, the ordinary water the whole community swam in. And then, almost overnight, with the passing of what they called the Sugar Act and the sudden tightening of the customs service, that same ordinary trade was reclassified. And a man who had been a respectable merchant one year found himself, doing the very same things the next year, branded a smuggler. The king's customs men given new teeth to hunt him, and you can feel how that would land on a proud independent man who had built everything out of nothing, not like the law correcting a wrong, but like a hand closing slowly around the throat of his livelihood, a distant government reaching across an ocean to take a cut of the bread he had earned with his own sweat. And it bred in men like Arnold a resentment at once high and principled and utterly personal, in which the great word liberty and the figures at the bottom of a ledger were tied so tightly you could not have pulled them apart. And the temper of the man showed itself again, grown up now and dangerous, for Arnold never suffered anything quietly. And there is an episode from these years that shows it plainly, when a sailor who had worked for him went to the customs authorities and informed on him, told the officers what cargoes had come in without their duties paid, and to Arnold this was not a business risk, but a betrayal, an insult, a stain upon his honour that his whole prickly soul could not let stand. And so he and some friends laid hands on the informer and gave him a public whipping and drove him out of town, a rough and lawless and passionate thing, and revealing, because it tells you that here was a man for whom a slight was never a thing to be shrugged off, but a thing that demanded an answer made with fists and force and the flushed heat of wounded pride. And there was another such answer given far away in a foreign port, a duel, a quarrel settled in the old way with pistols, and whether every detail is exactly as it came down we cannot say, but the shape of it rings true. because this was a man built to duel. A man who carried his honour the way another man carries a wound, always tender, always ready to flare, and that same fierce, touchy sense of his own worth, which made him such a formidable and such an impossible man, is the very thing we will watch do him both his greatest services and his most terrible harm. So hold him gently and truly here, neither saint nor monster, but something more human. A striving, prickly, hot-tempered, genuinely capable young man on the make, working harder than most, reaching further than most, feeling every insult more keenly than most, a man you might have admired and might have found very hard to get along with, both at once. And his politics grew straight out of all of this, so that when London reached further still and laid on the Americans the hated Stamp Act, a tax on the very paper of their daily life, on their documents and newspapers and playing cards, Arnold was among the first and angriest to stand against it, an early open member of those who called themselves the Sons of Liberty. And for him this was no cool philosophical position, but a merchant's fury and a free man's conviction fused into one, so that by the time the colonies drifted toward open rupture, Benedict Arnold of New Haven was already known as a man hotly on the side of American liberty, a patriot before the word had hardened, and there is an irony in that we will hold very lightly, that the man whose name would one day become the byword for betraying this cause was, at its beginning, among its earliest and most passionate friends. But a man is not only his trade and his temper, and in the midst of all this striving, in the year 1767, Arnold married, and the woman he married was Margaret Mansfield, the daughter of the Sheriff of New Haven, a good match for a rising merchant, and they made a home, and in time there were 3 sons, and he named them Benedict, after himself and the whole long line behind him. And Richard, and Henry, and here is the ache folded into the picture, that he was so seldom there to see them grow, because the sea was always calling him away, and a captain who sailed his own ships was gone for weeks and months at a time, so that the keeping of the household and the minding of the shop and the watching over of the little boys fell often to another, and that other was his sister Hannah, the same Hannah of the Norwich years, unmarried, steady, capable, devoted to her difficult brother, who came to live in his house and became the quiet fixed centre of it, running the business when he was at sea, and raising his children when he was over the horizon, faithful and largely unthanked, so it is good to meet her clearly here. Minding shop and children in the long salt-smelling absences while the ships were out. And the years passed in this way, the trading and building years, prosperity coming and going with the voyages and the debts, the marriage settling, the sons growing, the quarrel with the crown deepening all the while like a tide coming slowly in. And by the early 1770s Benedict Arnold had become exactly the thing he had set out from Norwich to become, a man of substance, a prosperous and respected merchant of New Haven, a captain and a shipowner, a husband and a father, the fallen name lifted up again and made to mean something. The father's failure answered and undone by the son's hard success. And if the great gathering storm had somehow blown over, we might remember him, if at all only as one more able, striving New England merchant who did well and died in his bed. And that is worth pausing on gently. How close every large and terrible life stands, at some early point, to a small ordinary one it might have been instead. But the storm did not blow over, it broke, in the spring of 1775, and by then Arnold's zeal had carried him from the counting-house into arms, for he had been made captain of the local militia, a smart, well-drilled volunteer company of New Haven men, called the Governor's Second Company of Guards, and he took to the soldiering with the same fierce energy he took to everything, drilling and outfitting them handsomely, so that when the moment came there was a body of ready men with Benedict Arnold at their head. And the moment came suddenly, riding down the post roads from Massachusetts, the news everyone had dreaded, that blood had at last been spilled, that the king's soldiers and the country people had fired upon one another at a village called Lexington, and again at a bridge in Concord, that the long war of words had become, in a single April morning, a war of powder and lead, and it reached Arnold, and everything in him that had been building for years, the resentment and the conviction and the hunger to matter and to act, came together in a single hard purpose. He did not hesitate. Hesitation was never his trouble. He called out his company and told them they were marching north toward Cambridge, where the New England men were gathering to pen the king's army in Boston. And when the cautious town fathers, wishing to wait and see, refused at first to give up the keys to the powder house so his men might arm, Arnold did the thing that was purely Arnold. He stood before them and demanded the keys, and let it be known that if they were not handed over at once his men would break the doors and take the powder anyway, that the cause would not wait upon the timid. And the keys were handed over, and his company armed itself and set off up the road toward the war. And as Benedict Arnold rode north in that bright, dangerous spring, 34 years old, a merchant turned captain riding toward the smoke, there was already forming in the restless calculating part of his brain a particular and daring idea, and it was about a fort. An old, grey fort far to the northwest on the long narrow water of Lake Champlain, in the country between the settled colonies and Canada, a place called Ticonderoga, and what Arnold knew about it, from his years as a trader on those northern waters, were two simple facts that fit together like a key in a lock. The first, that the fort was held only very thinly, garrisoned by a small handful of British soldiers grown sleepy in a time of peace. So few that the place could likely be taken by surprise almost without a fight, and the second, that inside that lightly held old fort there sat a great quantity of heavy cannon, real artillery, the big guns that could batter down walls and throw iron across a mile, the very thing the gathering rebel army outside Boston did not have and desperately needed, for a crowd of men with muskets, however brave, cannot drive a professional army out of a fortified town without guns, and there were the guns, sitting almost unguarded, hundreds of miles away, waiting. And so when Arnold reached the churning improvised camp of the siege, where nobody quite yet commanded anybody, he did not keep this idea to himself. He carried it straight to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, the small anxious body trying to turn a furious mob into an army, and he laid before them the whole clean scheme, the thinly held fort, the sleeping garrison, the cannon that could win the siege. And he offered to go and take it himself, and you can imagine how such a proposal sounded to worried men who had almost nothing. And here came this confident, well-spoken captain with a map in his mind and an answer to their greatest lack, and they listened, and they were persuaded, and they gave him a commission as a colonel and orders to march northwest and seize Fort Ticonderoga and its precious guns. And Arnold did not wait about. He set off at once with the speed that was always his gift, riding hard toward the lake, certain that this was his stroke, his idea, his fort to take, and it is here, at the very threshold of his first great success, that we meet for the first time the particular trouble that would shadow this man the whole rest of his life, and it is worth speaking of softly, because it was not wickedness, only the ordinary friction of proud men wanting the same thing at the same time. For as Arnold rode toward Ticonderoga with his commission in his pocket, he discovered to his considerable vexation that he was not the only one who had thought of it, that another party was already moving on the very same fort with the very same purpose, a rough and famous band of frontiersmen from the wild green hills of what we now call Vermont, men who called themselves the Green Mountain Boys, and at their head a large, loud, fearless, tremendously popular man named Ethan Allen. And here is the difficulty in a sentence, that these men were loyal to Ethan Allen personally, the big backwoods leader they had followed and fought beside, and not in the least to a newly minted colonel from New Haven whom they had never seen. A man of the coast and the counting house riding up waving a piece of paper. So the two forces converged on the same lake shore, and the two proud men met, and there was a real and prickly awkwardness, because Arnold insisted, correctly by the letter of the thing, that he held a proper commission and the right to command, while Allen's rough boys made it very plain, in the blunt way of frontiersmen, that they had not walked all this way to take orders from a stranger, and that if this coastal colonel were put over them they would set down their muskets and go home, and let the whole fine plan collapse. And so there they were, on the very eve of the thing, two able and stubborn men, each with a genuine claim. Arnold with the paper and the formal right. Alan with the men and their loyalty, neither able to do it without the other. And to their lasting credit, these two hot-tempered men did not let their pride wreck the enterprise. They reached instead a grudging, uneasy arrangement, an understanding that they would go in together, side by side, sharing the command rather than fighting over it, and however sour the question of who truly led remained underneath, they agreed on the one thing that mattered that night, which was to take the fort. And the taking of it is one of those small bright moments in a hard story where almost everything goes right and almost no one is hurt. A near bloodless little victory to rest on for a moment in the dark. For in the small black hours of the 10th of May, in 1775, the combined party gathered on the shore of Lake Champlain, meaning to cross and fall upon the sleeping fort before first light, and there were not enough boats, there were never enough boats, and only a part of the force could be ferried over before the sky began to pale. But Alan and Arnold judged rightly that it was better to rush the place at once than to wait and lose the darkness, and so with only a fraction of their number they crept up on the old fort in the grey hush before dawn, past a single startled sentry whose musket, the story goes, misfired harmlessly, and in through the gate to where the little garrison lay asleep, wholly unsuspecting, with no notion that a war had even begun. And it was here that Ethan Allen made the demand history hung his fame upon, roaring that the commander must surrender the fort at once. And when the bewildered half-dressed British officer asked by whose authority, Allen is said to have thundered that it was in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, a grand thumping phrase that has echoed ever since, though we may hold it softly, since Allen wrote it down himself years later, and the words may well have grown rounder in the retelling. And whatever was truly said, the result was almost gentle, for the astonished garrison, hopelessly outnumbered, gave up the fort with hardly a shot, and the old grey stronghold passed into rebel hands in the space of a single quiet morning, and with it, the whole point of all of it, there fell into those hands the great store of heavy cannon and powder and shot, dozens of guns of all sizes, a treasure of artillery for an army that had none. And let us follow that treasure a little way forward, because it is a soothing thread, for those very guns would in the depth of the following winter be dragged hundreds of miles across the frozen country, on ox-drawn sledges to the siege outside Boston, and set up on the heights above the town. And it was those guns, looming suddenly over the harbour, that made the British position impossible, and forced the King's army and ships to sail away and leave the town to the Americans, so that the sleepy fort Arnold had seen so clearly on that April road turned out to hold, quite literally, the key that opened the first great door of the war. And Arnold, having helped take the fort, was not a man to sit still inside stone walls savouring a success. For his instinct always, the truest thing about him as a soldier, was to press forward, to strike while the enemy was off balance, and so almost at once he gathered boats and men and pushed north up the long lake toward the Canadian border, striking swiftly at a British post called Fort St. John and carrying off what he could, a small sharp stroke deep toward enemy country done on his own initiative, showing the shape of the soldier he was, restless, aggressive, forever wanting to be a step ahead and on the attack. But first, on the very heels of the triumph, came the sourness, and it is a sourness we shall meet again and again, so it is worth naming it gently now, because it became in the end the great wound of him, for no sooner had the fort been taken than the quarrelling began over who had truly done it, and who should command what had been won, Allen's men and Arnold's claim rubbing against each other, and then, worse, other officers arriving with other commissions, sent up to take charge of the captured forts and the lake, superseding Arnold. Questioning his standing, so that the man who had conceived the stroke found himself almost at once elbowed aside, his command disputed, his very right to be there challenged by newcomers with paper of their own. And there was worse still, of the kind that stings a proud man most sharply, for his accounts came into question, the sums he had spent and how. the ordinary tangled money of an expedition thrown together in haste, and committees began to want explanations, and Arnold, who knew with perfect certainty that he had seen the thing clearly and served the cause well, felt the old bitter feeling rising that he would feel so many times again, the feeling that other men, slower and safer and better connected, were quietly gathering in the credit he had earned, reaping where he had risked. And though the fault was not all on one side, for Arnold was a hard man to share command with and quick to feel a slight, still there was real substance to his grievance too, that he had seen it first and dared it most, and was pushed to the margin of his own success. And into the middle of all this outward vexation there came a private blow of a deeper kind, a quiet grief that had nothing to do with forts or glory. For while Arnold was away up north in the summer of that year, his wife Margaret, the mother of his 3 small sons, fell ill and died at home, far from him, in that June of 1775, and he was not there, he was hundreds of miles away on the lake, and the word of it had to travel all that long way, so that he learned of his own wife's death late and far off, alone in a military camp, a widower before he even knew he was one, the great personal sorrow arriving as stale news across a distance. And it left him a widower with 3 little boys back in Connecticut, now motherless, in the care of his devoted sister Hannah, who kept his house through all his long absences, while Arnold himself was far away with a war that would not pause for his grief. And so you find him that summer carrying 2 heavy things at once, the outward bitterness of the command, disputes and the credit slipping into other men's hands, and the inward, far greater weight of the wife lost while his back was turned, and the 2 together soured him thoroughly on the whole tangled business up on the lake, until at last, stung and grieving and out of patience, he did what a proud man does when he feels ill-used. He resigned the Massachusetts colonelcy they had granted him that hopeful April, and turned his horse away from the lake, but he did not turn toward home, toward rest, toward the grave of his wife and the arms of his motherless sons, which is perhaps the most telling thing of all about the man, for instead of retiring to mourn he rode toward Cambridge, toward the great camp outside Boston where a new commander had just arrived to take charge of the whole rebel cause, a tall grey Virginian named George Washington, and Arnold rode toward him carrying something far bigger and more perilous than any lightly held fort, a scheme of real audacity that had been growing in him through all these weeks of triumph and grief, nothing less than a plan to strike at the very heart of British Canada, to march an army north not by the known waterways, but straight through the vast roadless wilderness of the Maine woods, over the mountains and down the far rivers, to fall upon the walled city of Quebec from a direction no one would ever expect. And the great idea was not turned away as a lesser man's wild scheme might have been, but taken up and weighed, and at last approved, for Washington, only just come north to take charge of the raw army, listened to this restless, energetic merchant, and saw in him something worth risking, and the plan had a clean, simple shape. For while one American army, under a gentle, capable general named Richard Montgomery, would push north the ordinary way, up the long lakes by Ticonderoga toward Montreal, striking at Canada by the door everyone expected, Arnold would take a second smaller column by a door no one watched at all, straight up through the trackless wilderness of Maine, and down again toward Quebec, to fall upon it from the empty forested east out of which no enemy was ever supposed to come. And if the 2 arms of the plan closed together, Canada might be swept into the rebellion in a single autumn, and the whole northern flank of the young cause made safe. So Washington gave him the men, something like 1,100 of them, and the rank to lead them, and there is a doomed quiet grandeur in the picture of it. 1,100 men, and one driving tireless colonel, setting out in the last green of the year, to walk into a country that had no roads, no towns, no bridges, nothing but water and forest and rising ground and the coming of winter, carrying boats they would soon come to hate, all of them believing, as men setting out always believe, that it would be hard but brief, and none of them yet knowing the slow patient arithmetic of suffering the wilderness had waiting. And you may let that not trouble you at all, for it is 16 decades and more gone now, and we are only going to follow it softly, from a great warm distance, the way you might watch a line of small figures moving across a far white hillside from a window where you are comfortable and safe. And they set off in September of 1775, going first by sea up the coast to the mouth of the Kennebec River, and then beginning the long push inland against the current. And here we meet the first of their sorrows, a humble and almost homely one, for it was the boats themselves that betrayed them, since the flat clumsy river craft they called bateau had been knocked together too quickly out of green unseasoned wood. And green wood does what green wood does. It shrinks and splits and opens its seams, so that these heavy awkward boats, hauled up against the falls and rapids of a wild river, began almost at once to leak and gape and come apart, and the water that seeped in did not only soak the men, it got into the food, into the barrels of bread and the casks of dried peas and the salted meat, spoiling it, turning good rations into wet ruin, so that the supplies on which the whole long march depended began quietly to fail them, before they had even truly begun to climb, and the men laboured waist deep in the cold river hauling the split boats over the stones, and lifted them, and carried them, and their shoulders learned early the weight that would be the whole shape of their days, and the river gave way in time to the great portages, the carrying places, where the water could not be followed at all, and everything, the boats and barrels and guns and powder, had to be taken up onto the men's own bodies and carried overland across broken rising country, and the worst of these had a name that has come down to us plain and heavy, the Great Carrying Place. A long gruelling passage across toward the waters of the dead river, miles over hills and through bog where a man would carry a barrel or a boat forward on his shoulders until he could not, and set it down, and walk back for the next load, so that every mile of ground was walked 3 times and more, forward loaded and back empty, and forward loaded again, and the labour of it in the shortening days wore them down as surely as a stone is worn by water. For between the ridges lay swamps and half-frozen marsh where a man sank to his knees in cold black muck. And the autumn rains came down freezing day after day, soaking the powder and the bread and the men alike, and the nights turned hard with frost, so that clothing frozen stiff had to be thawed by morning fires. And a griping dysentery began to move quietly through the column, the way sickness does among cold and hungry and exhausted men. And then, when they had gained the dead river at last, and hoped for easier going, the sky itself turned against them, for a great storm came down out of the north, and the rains fell in such quantity that the river rose and overflowed until the men could scarcely tell where the channel had been, and the flood swept some of the precious boats away, and drowned more of the food, and scattered the column, and it would have broken most bodies of men entirely. And yet, this is the quiet wonder that runs under the whole hard story. Most of them did not break. They simply endured it, and gathered themselves, and went on. And by now the food was very nearly gone, and here we come to the hardest part of the tale, and yet, told softly, the most human, for hunger came down on that column in earnest, with nothing left in the barrels to answer it, and the men did what starving men have always done. They boiled their leather. They boiled the shoes off their own feet and the leather of their cartridge boxes, and stewed the rawhide for hours to make a thin foul broth of it, and one account tells us they even boiled a little shaving soap simply to have something warm in their stomachs, and the few dogs that had followed the army were given up as well, quietly, because a hungry man will do what he must. And I tell you these things not to trouble your rest, but only so you may understand the measure of what these men bore, and did not surrender to, for they went on hungry. They simply kept walking, day after grey day, up toward the high ground. And in the middle of all this came the hardest blow of all. One Arnold could do nothing to prevent. For the rear division, some hundreds of men under a lieutenant colonel named Roger Enos, looking at the flooded river and the spoiled provisions and the fearful road still ahead, took counsel and decided that to go on was to die, and turned back and marched home the way they had come, carrying with them not only a third of the whole force, but a good share of the food that yet remained, so that the men who chose to go forward were left fewer and hungrier than before, and Arnold, away at the front where he almost always was, could not reach back across the miles to change a single mind, and had only to absorb the loss and press on. And there is no bitterness worth carrying about it across all these years, for men are only men, and fear is only fear, and it is enough simply to name the endurance of those who went on, the 600 or 700 who chose the mountains and the hunger over the long safe road home. And Arnold himself was everywhere at the head of them, driving, wading the cold rivers, sleeping on the wet ground like the rest, and using that furious energy in the one way it could most help. For he pushed ahead of the starving column with a small party, hurrying down toward the first settlements of Canada to buy whatever cattle and flour he could and send it back up the trail into the mouths of his failing men. And this he actually managed, so that when the exhausted column came down out of the worst of it there was food coming up to meet them, driven up the path on the hoof, a little salvation arranged by the sheer will of the man at the front who would not let them lie down and be finished. And the crossing of the height of land was itself a passage through snow and tangled forest, boats abandoned now, men carrying only what they could bear, wandering half lost among the ridges, and then on the far side the ground began to fall away northward, and they came down onto the swift rough waters of the Chaudière, which swallowed more of their boats in its rapids, and yet ran the right way, down toward the great valley of the St. Lawrence and the end of the wilderness, and to men who had walked through 6 weeks of that green and white hell the first farms and the first friendly Canadian faces must have been like waking gently from a long hard dream. And so at last, in the middle of November, gaunt and ragged and hollow-cheeked, their shoes gone and their bodies worn to cord and bone, the survivors of Arnold's column came out of the forest onto the south bank of the St. Lawrence across the wide grey water from the walled city of Quebec itself having marched, by the best reckoning of that trackless route, something like 350 miles in about 6 weeks, and of the 1,100 who had set out there, were perhaps 600 left to stand and look across the river, and there is something quiet and enormous at once in that arrival, that these 600 scarecrows had done a thing sober men had said could not be done, had walked out of the wilderness by a door no army was ever meant to use, and stood now, hungry and half-frozen and utterly spent, gazing at the rock of Quebec. And yet the mere arriving was not the taking, for Quebec was a walled city high on its rock, strong by nature and strengthened by men, and Arnold's little band had no heavy guns worth the name and no numbers to storm such a place. So they could do little but wait and gather themselves and look for the other arm of the plan. And it came, for General Montgomery, having taken Montreal by his easier road, brought his own force down the river to join them. And the two commands came together before the city, Montgomery gentle and capable, and Arnold fierce and driven, and together still they were only a small army, a few hundred worn men and a handful of guns, sitting down to besiege a fortified city as the Canadian winter came down in earnest. And it was a hopeless siege, and in their hearts they must have known it, and the cold deepened, and the terms of enlistment of many of the men were due to run out with the ending of the year, so that the little army was in danger of simply dissolving in the frost. And out of that hard arithmetic came the desperate resolve to try, before the men melted away, to take the city by storm, to go straight at it under cover of darkness and weather. And they chose the very last night of the year, and waited for a snowstorm to hide them, and on the night of the 31st of December in 1775, in a driving, blinding snow, the little army moved in 2 columns down against the lower town of Quebec, Montgomery leading one wing and Arnold the other, and I will tell the rest of it softly, for it is a sad thing and there is no need to make it sharp, since it went wrong almost from the first. For the snow that hid them also blinded them and slowed them and soaked their powder, and Montgomery, pressing forward at the head of his column toward a barricade in the lower town, was met by a sudden blast of cannon and musketry at close range, and was killed almost at once, struck down in the snow in the first moments of his attack. And with their gentle general dead the heart went out of that wing, and the assault on that side collapsed, and Arnold, leading his own wing in against the barricades, pressing forward as he always did, at the very front of his men where a commander perhaps ought not to be, but where he could never help being, was struck early by a musket ball that tore into his lower left leg, below the knee, and the wound was bad enough that he could not stand upon it, and he had to be carried from the field while the fight still raged, and I would have you mark that wound gently. That ball in the lower left leg on the last night of the year, for it is the first wounding of the leg upon which this whole long story quietly turns, the same leg that will be broken and torn again on a far more famous day still years ahead of us, so that of all the hurts a hard-used body can take, it is this left leg that carries the thread of the whole life. And with Arnold down, the command of his wing passed to the tough-dogged rifleman Daniel Morgan, who fought on into the narrow streets with a stubbornness that does him honour, taking one barricade and pressing toward the next. But the columns were broken now and unsupported, and the defenders closed in around them in the tangled lanes. And in the end, Morgan and the men still on their feet were surrounded and cut off and taken, hundreds of them made prisoners in the cold streets of the city they had walked 350 miles to reach. And so the great assault failed, and Montgomery lay dead in the snow, and hundreds of good men were captives inside the walls, and it would have been the most natural thing in the world, and no shame in it, for the wounded Arnold to give the whole thing up, to lift the siege and lead the ragged remnant home, and that is precisely what he would not do, and here is the picture to carry down into sleep, this stubborn wounded man lying in the winter camp outside Quebec with his leg bound up and unable even to walk, refusing simply to let go, holding on with a skeleton force through the deep cold and on into the spring, keeping up a long freezing futile blockade of a city he had no real hope of taking, because to hold on was to keep the thing alive, and to let go was to admit it dead. And for that fierce unbroken valour, he was made a brigadier general even as he lay there in the snow, promoted for a defeat born like a victory. And he held on through the short bitter days and the long nights, while smallpox crept through his little army and thinned it as surely as the muskets had, until at last, when the ice broke on the great river in the spring of the following year and British ships came up the St. Lawrence with fresh troops aboard, the long-doomed blockade could be held no longer, and the ragged, sick, beaten American force gave up the ground and began its slow, painful retreat back up the country toward the lakes, out of Canada, back the way the whole grand gamble had come. And so it was on the water, in the warm failing light of the summer of 1776, that the whole northern adventure seemed at last to come apart in his hands, for the great bold plan had failed, not in one sharp defeat, but in the slow grinding way most campaigns really fail, by sickness and shortage and cold and the steady arrival of fresh enemy ships, and the army that came back down the long trough of Lake Champlain that summer was not truly an army any longer, but only the worn grey remnant of one, wasted by the smallpox that moved through the crowded boats like a slow fire through dry. Grass, ragged and short of powder and food, and nearly everything except the will of the few who still had any left. And behind them, coming on with all the patience of a man who knows the season is his to spend, was the British Governor of Canada, Sir Guy Carleton, a careful and rather humane soldier who now had under his hand a proper army, fresh from England, well fed and well armed and confident, gathering itself at the northern foot of the lake to do the one thing the whole British design for that year required, which was to come south down this water and take the fortresses and reach the upper Hudson, and so drive a wedge clean through the middle of the rebellious colonies, cutting the hot-headed east of New England away from the rest, so that the rebellion, split in two, might bleed quietly to a close. And it is worth resting on how narrow the margin truly was that summer, for between that gathering army and the soft green heart of the Hudson Valley there lay really only one thing, and that thing was the lake itself, the long, cold north and south corridor of Champlain, and whoever ruled the lake would in the end rule the road. And the sobering truth was that the Americans had almost nothing with which to rule it, no navy worth the name, only a handful of small captured craft and a few hundred sick men and the fading remains of a beaten army, and a great deal of open water over which, if nothing were done, the British ships would simply come sailing south at their leisure to make an end of the war. And it was here, at exactly this low and unpromising point, that Benedict Arnold did the thing this chapter is really about. the thing that even those who came to hate his name have never quite been able to take away from him. For he looked at the one asset that no one else in that whole Northern Command truly understood. And the asset was ships. Because before he had ever been a soldier at all, Benedict Arnold had been a merchant and a sea captain out of Connecticut, a man who knew hulls and rigging and the set of a sail and the temper of moving water in the way only a man who has made his living upon it can know such things. And so where the generals around him saw only an impossible stretch of undefended lake, Arnold almost alone saw a thing that might yet be built and fought and used, and he threw himself into the building of it with that furious, tireless energy that was the truest engine of his nature, setting out in the plainest terms to conjure a freshwater navy very nearly out of the standing trees. And so through the whole length of that summer and on into the first cool weeks of autumn there rose, at the little settlement of Skenesborough at the marshy southern end of the lake, and at the old works of Ticonderoga, a rough clamorous shipyard where there had been almost nothing, and the work of it was a kind of miracle of improvisation that is gentle to picture. The felling of green timber straight from the forest that ringed the water, still wet and heavy with sap, dragged down to the shore, and sawn and shaped and hammered into hulls by men who were mostly not shipwrights at all, but soldiers and farmers and militiamen turned to the work. For there was a constant scarcity of true carpenters and caulkers and smiths and riggers and sailmakers, so that Arnold was forever writing away for more of them, for anchors and canvas and cordage and iron and swivel guns, and forever making do with a fraction of what he asked. And yet somehow, plank by green plank, the little fleet took shape upon the water. And it was not a beautiful fleet nor a mighty one. It was a fleet of what the age called gundelows, flat, simple, open boats, little more than barges, each with a mast and a single sail and a few guns in the bows and along the sides, slow and clumsy and hard to handle and desperately open to the weather and the enemy's fire. And alongside these he built a handful of larger and better vessels, the row galleys, longer and stronger and carrying more guns and able to be driven by oars when the wind failed. And these were the backbone of what he had, and he named them in the plain, proud, hopeful way of that new country, the Congress and the Washington and the Trumbull and the rest, and manned them as best he could with a scraped-together crew of soldiers who had never been to sea and sailors who were too few, and drilled them, and fretted over their want of everything, and all the while he knew, because he was too clear-eyed not that far to the north his enemy was doing the very same thing on a far grander and better furnished scale. For Carleton understood the lake as well as Arnold did, and had at the northern end every advantage that Arnold lacked, the whole trained resource of the Royal Navy, real shipwrights and seamen brought up from the fleet, real guns and stores in abundance. And he set them to a labour that is astonishing to sit with, for he had brought up from the sea larger warships than could ever have sailed the rapids that connected the lake to the great river, and rather than be stopped by the water itself his men took those ships apart plank from plank, hauled the numbered pieces overland around the rapids, and rebuilt them again upon the open lake above. Chief among them a full 3-masted ship called the Inflexible, mounting 18 good guns, against which nothing Arnold owned could stand in fair fight for long, and Carleton took his time, gathering and arming until his squadron was in every measurable way stronger, more ships and heavier ships, and better served guns and seasoned sailors. And this was the strange, quiet race that ran on through those late summer weeks, 2 improvised navies rising at opposite ends of one long lake, the one larger and slower to be ready, the other smaller and racing to be ready first, and the whole northern cause hung upon which of them would be finished when the 2 came together. And Arnold, knowing himself the weaker, did the only wise thing a weaker man can do, which is to refuse to fight the battle his enemy wished, and to choose instead the ground upon which he would make his stand. And the ground he chose was a place called Valcour Island, a low wooded island lying close against the western shore with a narrow channel of water running between the island and the land, a snug sheltered strait screened from the open lake by the bulk of the island. And here Arnold brought his little fleet in and anchored it in a rough crescent across that narrow water. And the cleverness of it, a pleasure to unfold slowly, was simply this, that a strong fleet's whole advantage lies in open water, where its greater numbers can all be brought to bear at once. And in that cramped channel none of Carleton's strength could tell as it wished, for his big ships would have to come at the American line a few at a time, beating up into a contrary wind through a strait too tight to manoeuvre, so that the smaller fleet, fighting from a chosen position, might trade blows on something nearer to even terms than it had any right to expect. And so it fell out, on the morning of the 11th of October in 1776, that the great British squadron came sailing grandly down the open lake from the north, with a fair wind behind it past the island, looking for the American fleet that was not where it had expected, and only when it had gone by did the British see the trap of it. The little American ships tucked away in the channel behind Valcour to the enemy's rear, so that the whole proud squadron now had to turn and struggle back up against that same wind, working into the narrow water piecemeal and in disorder, exactly as Arnold had planned. And then began the long day's pounding, the hardest fighting Arnold's raw sailors would ever see, hour upon hour of it, the guns firing across the close grey water until the channel was choked with the smoke of the powder, the crash of rounds shot into green timber, the little gundelows taking their punishment and giving it back as best their few guns could, and it was very far from bloodless, for one of the schooners, the Royal Savage, went aground early upon the point of the island, and was lost and burned. And the vessels that fought on took such a battering that by nightfall the little fleet was half wrecked, hulls shattered and leaking, spars down, guns dismounted, powder running low, and men dead and dying on the open decks, and Arnold himself was everywhere at once in the thick of it, laying the guns of his own galley with his own hands because he had too few trained gunners, spending himself without the least thought for his own safety in the way that was by now simply the manner of the man. And when the early autumn dark came down and the firing died, the arithmetic was grim, for the British had drawn off only a little to anchor for the night and take up the fight again at first light, lying in a line across the southern mouth of the channel to bottle the shattered American fleet into that strait and finish it in the morning, and there was by every ordinary reckoning no way out. The enemy across the one exit, the fleet broken, the powder nearly gone. And it is here that the quietest and cleverest stroke of the whole affair belongs, a thing done not with cannon, but with silence and cold nerve. For that night a heavy fog and a deep darkness settled down over the water, and Arnold, rather than wait to be destroyed at dawn, resolved upon an escape so daring in its simplicity that it hardly seems it should have worked. And one by one, in a single long file, with a shaded lantern hung at the stern of each vessel, showing only backward to the ship behind, and with the oars muffled and the men ordered to the strictest quiet, the surviving American ships crept out from behind the island and rowed slowly, softly, straight along the shore and clean past the very line of the anchored British fleet, so close in the fog and the dark that the low creak of the oars and the lap of the water were the only sounds, slipping one after another through the gap between the enemy and the land, while the enemy, certain of his prey, kept watch upon a channel his birds had already left, and it is a scene worth resting upon in the calm of this hour. The broken little boats stealing away in the fog with their wounded and their dead aboard, saying nothing, showing no light to the water, gliding past the sleeping guns of a stronger foe and out into the open lake to the south. And when the morning came, and the fog lifted, the British looked, and found the channel empty, and could scarcely believe it. And yet the escape, brilliant as it was, could only buy a little time, for the American ships were too battered and slow to run fast before the wind, and Carleton, once he understood, set his faster vessels in pursuit, and there followed over the next day, and more a long-running fight down the lake, a slow, painful chase in which the British steadily overhauled the crippled American rear end, pounded it as they came up, so that one by one the surviving vessels were caught and battered and taken or driven under, the little fleet dwindling hour by hour, until Arnold, with his own galley the Congress beaten almost to a wreck beneath him, and a small clutch of the gundelows still with him, saw plainly that the water offered no more escape, and made then his last decision of the campaign, that whatever else happened his ships should not be handed over to the enemy as prizes, and so he turned the battered remnant in toward the eastern shore, ran them aground upon a beach, and set them afire with their flags still flying, standing by, it is said, to see that the colours were not struck and no vessel fell whole into British hands. And only when the ships were well ablaze did he land his surviving men and lead them off on foot through the woods, some 10 miles overland back toward the shelter of Crown Point and Ticonderoga, bringing his people home the hard way when the water would carry them no farther. And so, if a person tallies it up in the plain hard columns of a ledger, the Battle of Valcour Island was a defeat, and not a small one, for Arnold had lost the greater part of his fleet, sunk and burned and captured in the space of 3 days, and there were men then, and men since, who looked no further than that column of losses, and saw only another of Arnold's costly failures. And yet here is the gentle correction this chapter has been walking toward, the thing the ledger can never show. For the true measure of Valcour was never in the ships that were lost, but in the weeks that were won. Because every week Arnold had spent hammering his navy together was a week Carleton had been forced to spend building a stronger one to meet it. And the fight itself, and the long chase after it, cost the British still more days of a season already growing dangerously late. So that by the time Carleton had beaten the American fleet and come up within sight of Ticonderoga, it was the middle of October, with the hard northern winter already breathing down the lake. And the careful governor, looking at the strong fortress before him and the failing weather behind him and the long exposed line back to Canada, judged that it was too late in the year to press on, and did the prudent thing and turned his whole army about and withdrew north again to winter in Canada, meaning to finish the work in the spring. But that lost season could never be recovered, and it is no romance to say the little burnt fleet had bought it, for the delay Arnold's stand had forced upon the enemy pushed the great British thrust down the lake out of 76 altogether and into the following year, and when at last the British did come down that same corridor of water under another and rasher general, they came a full year later than they might have, into a country better prepared and an army grown stronger, and they came to grief at last upon the fields near a place called Saratoga, in the very victory that would turn the whole war, so that this defeat upon the lake was in the deepest sense one of the truly saving actions of the Northern War, a battle lost that helped to win the war. And there is a soft justice in remembering it so, in setting down that the man rode away in the fog with the wreck of everything he had built without quite knowing the whole of it, delivered the cause from ruin. And so we leave him coming in weary and blackened from the burning of his own ships to the walls of Ticonderoga, and the reception that met him there was already the divided, unsettled thing that would follow him for all the rest of his days. For there were those who understood at once what he had truly done and spoke of him with wonder, as the one man who had stood between the lake and the loss of everything, and there were others, their number quietly growing, who saw only another command wrecked, another expensive failure to lay against his name, and between those two readings of the same brave deed the reputation of Benedict Arnold went on hardening into the strange double thing it would always be, a byword for reckless brilliance and headlong courage on the one hand, and a magnet for suspicion and resentment on the other, admired and distrusted in almost the same breath, and even now. With the smoke of Valcour scarcely off him, there was gathering about him that lengthening company of officers who felt slighted by his rise, or wounded by his tongue, or simply jealous of the notice he drew. And there were the accounts, always the accounts, the tangled unsettled reckonings of money spent and owed from Canada and the lake, sums he had laid out and could not easily prove, claims that would not come right, and it is into that murkier and more sorrowful country that the next part of the story carries us, away from the clean hard clarity of guns and water, where a brave man knows exactly what is asked of him, and on into the dimmer tangled ground of jealousy and rank and money and wounded pride, where the things that finally undid him were not enemies at all, but slights and grievances and unpaid debts, and where the long slow souring of a proud and gallant heart, drop by patient drop, had already, though he did not yet feel it, quietly begun. And so we come now to a quieter part of the road, a stretch with no battles in it and no burning ships, only a man at home for a while, resting a body that had been used hard, and yet in its own soft way the most important stretch of the whole journey. because this is the winter and the spring in which the slow arithmetic began, the patient adding up of small wounds that would in the end decide everything. The story of how a good and brave man can be worn thin, drop by drop, by the sense that the thing he is giving everything to does not love him back. Picture him then in the early months of 1777, home in Connecticut, a proven fighting general now, a man whose courage not a single soul in America would have dared to question, for Quebec and Valcourt were his and everyone knew it, and yet here he was, home, in and out of the great man's headquarters, waiting, as soldiers so often must wait, for the next thing to be decided by others, and there was in him already, coiled quietly, the whole tangle of things this chapter must lay out, the temper that ran hot and quick, the debts that were mounting, the accounts that would not settle, and the growing sense of slights given and honours withheld. And under it all lay the one thing that explains the rest, that his whole life had been about lifting up a fallen name, the name his father's drink and ruin had shamed in the very streets where it had once stood proud, so that honour to this man was not vanity but the very centre of him, the wound he had spent his life trying to heal, which meant that every slight went straight down to the oldest and deepest hurt he had, and pressed on it. And this is why the first great blow of this season landed as hard as it did, and it landed in February, in the depth of that winter, when word came down from the Continental Congress, sitting far off, that they had chosen to promote 5 men from Brigadier General up to Major General in a single stroke, and Arnold read down the list of the 5 names, and his own was not among them. And worse, every single one of the 5 stood below him on the ladder, 5 brigadiers who had all been made brigadier after he had, junior to him every one, lifted now up over his head, so that men who had been beneath him were suddenly above him, and there is no soldier in any age who could feel that and not feel it as a public shaming, a thing done out where all the world could see. And to Arnold, with his lifelong terror of a shamed name, it was not a disappointment but a wound, and it cut exactly where he was least able to bear a cut. And here I want to be fair to the Congress, gently, because they had their reasons, and their reasons were not wicked. They were only the ordinary tangled reasons of men trying to hold a fragile new thing together, for the Congress was not one mind, but many, a gathering of delegates from 13 jealous states, each state watching to see that it got its fair share of everything, its fair share of generals as much as anything else, and by the unspoken bookkeeping of the day it was, felt that Connecticut, Arnold's own state, already had as many major generals as its size entitled it to. And so the new promotions were parcelled out with an eye to that balance, to giving this state and that state their due, rather than with a cold eye to pure merit and seniority, and Arnold happened to fall on the wrong side of that arithmetic, passed over not because anyone judged him a lesser soldier, for no one did, but because of where he came from and how the account books of regional fairness happened to stand, and a cooler man with a shallower wound underneath might have shrugged and waited his turn. But Arnold was not that man, and he felt it as an insult delivered to the whole watching world, and something in him that February began quietly to curdle. And there is a figure who moves through this part of the story, who must be kept in view, because his presence makes the whole thing sadder and also warmer, and that is Washington, the commander. For when he learned Arnold had been passed over, he was genuinely surprised and troubled by it, because he knew exactly what Arnold was worth in the field, knew there were few men in the whole army who could do what Arnold could do when the guns were firing, and he did not think it just, and said so, writing to Arnold to steady him and urge him not to do anything rash, and writing also to men of influence on Arnold's behalf, working behind the scenes in his patient way to see the thing put right. And it is worth resting on that picture, the commander-in-chief, with the whole weight of a losing war on his shoulders, taking time to soothe the pride of one wounded general. For it tells you how real Arnold's worth was in the eyes of the one man whose eyes mattered most, and that the tragedy of what came later was never a simple matter of a man unloved. For here was regard, a great man spending his own scarce patience to keep this brilliant prickly soldier in the fold, and Arnold, to his credit, heard it and held his temper, more or less, and did not resign then. though the word was already forming in him and would form again and again. And while that first wound was still fresh, before the spring was fully come, the war reached out and gave him at once both a chance at glory and one more turn of the same bitter screw. In his own home country of Connecticut, in the last days of April, when a strong British column came up from the coast and marched inland to the town of Danbury, where the Americans had gathered a great store of supplies, and burned the stores and much of the town, and Arnold, who happened to be near, did what he always did, threw himself straight at the trouble, gathering up whatever militia he could find and flinging himself into the path of the returning British column to harry it and make it pay. And there was hard fighting on those spring roads, and Arnold was everywhere in it, exposed and magnificent in exactly the way he always was when the shooting started. And in the thick of it his horse was shot dead beneath him, and he was pinned or thrown, tangled a moment with the fallen horse, while an enemy soldier came at him. And he freed himself, and fought clear, and went on, one more display of the pure headlong courage no one had ever denied him. And the Congress noticed, and now, stung perhaps by the obviousness of what they had done in February, they promoted Benedict Arnold to Major General, the rank they had withheld. And you might think the account squared, but here is the cruel, precise turn of it that made the honour arrive already spoiled. For in raising him they did not restore his seniority, did not set him back above the 5 men who had leapt over him, but left him ranking below them still, junior within his new grade to the very men who had passed him. So that the promotion, which should have been a balm, was instead a fresh reminder of the injury, a gift handed over with the sting still in it. And Arnold felt that too, that they had given him the title while withholding the thing he actually wanted, which was not the title but the acknowledgement, the public setting of his name back where his service said it belonged. And a man who wanted honour more than rank found himself handed rank as though it were honour, and knew the difference and was not comforted. And threaded all through these months, under the promotions and passings over, ran the other great strand of his trouble, the strand of money, and I want to speak of it plainly, because it is easy to hear the word money and think of greed, and it was not, or not only, greed, it was something more genuinely unjust than that, for Arnold had spent the past 2 years pouring not only his blood, but his own private fortune into the war, paying out of his own pocket for the things his campaigns needed when the Congress could not, buying supplies on the march to Quebec, laying out sums on the lakes for boats and provisions, advancing his own money on the understood promise that a grateful country would pay him back. And now the time had come to settle those accounts, and the settling would not settle, for the auditors looked at Arnold's tangled records, the receipts lost in the chaos of a retreat, the sums spent in a burning hurry with no clerk standing by, the whole messy paper trail of a fighting general who had never been a careful bookkeeper. And they questioned it and doubted it and held back the repayment, and refused some of what he claimed, so that a man who had impoverished himself in the service of the country found himself treated almost as a man suspected of cheating, and you can feel how that would land on top of everything else, how a man already stung over his rank would feel it doubly when the cause seemed to withhold even the plain repayment of money he had truly spent, so that the shape of his grievance hardened into a sense not merely of individual slights, but of a pattern, a country that took his blood and his money and his years and gave back doubt and delay and lesser men promoted over his head. And there were the feuds too, for Arnold was not an easy man to serve alongside, and his temper made enemies as readily as his courage made admirers, and in these months the accusations began to gather about him like crows. And 2 names come down to us out of that unhappy crowd, one a man named Moses Hazen, with whom Arnold quarrelled bitterly over the blame of the Canadian retreat, each trying to bring the other before a court, and the other, the sharper, a man named John Brown, who had conceived for Arnold a deep lasting animosity going back to Canada and pursued him with a persistence that never tired, and at last, when the official channels did not satisfy him, took his grievance to the printed page and published a broadside against Arnold's character. And in it was a line that has outlived almost everything else John Brown ever said, a single cruel quotable sentence, that money is this man's god, and whether it was fair or unfair, and it was surely at least half unfair to a man who had spent his own gold so freely on the cause, it was out in the world now. A phrase with a barb on it, and it must have been a particular misery to a man whose whole hunger was for honour to find himself branded in public as a man who cared only for money. And around all of this swirled the inquiries themselves, one after another, into his conduct and his accounts, so that a general who wanted nothing so much as to be honoured found himself forever standing before some panel to explain and justify. Cleared often enough, for the inquiries again and again found little against him. And yet even in being cleared he was wounded, because the very fact of forever being investigated is its own slow insult, its own suggestion that a man's honour is a thing in doubt, and there is no rest in that for a proud soul. And so you can see, laid out gently now, the sad geometry of the man, that here was a soldier of undoubted courage who kept giving his body to the cause over and over, and kept feeling in return that it withheld the two things he wanted most: honour and the outward marks of honour, the rank set right, the debts paid, the trust extended, so that each time the giving was met with a slight or a delay or a doubt, a little more resentment gathered in him, one drop and then another, a slow pooling in a low place, and threaded through it, again and again, was that word resign. For he threatened more than once to lay down his commission and let the country that would not honour him do without him, and each time Washington or one of the others who valued him would talk him back from the edge, and each time Arnold, who could no more stay away from a fight than a moth can stay from a candle, allowed himself to be persuaded and stayed, his grievances intact but his sword still drawn, still, for now, on the country's side. And it was in this state, wounded and proud and unsettled and bitter but unbroken, and still burning with the old fighting fire, that the late summer of 1777 found him. And the war now reached out once more, and called him back to exactly the place where his greatest deeds were waiting. For far to the north the great blow the British had been preparing was falling at last. A powerful army under a general named Burgoyne, driving south out of Canada, down along the very lakes Arnold knew so well, aiming to cut the rebellious colonies in two. Coming on now in the strength that Arnold's own ragged little fleet at Valcour had held back a year before, when the lateness of the season he had stolen from them had turned them home for the winter, and now that stolen year was spent, and the American army gathering to stop Burgoyne on the upper Hudson was a crumbling, anxious, uncertain thing, falling back before the British advance, in sore need of any man who knew how to fight. And so Arnold, carrying the whole sad ledger of his slights folded up inside him, and yet wholly unable, as always, to keep himself from the sound of the guns, was sent north toward that gathering army, and the cautious general named Gates, who was taking command of it, into the wooded country above the Hudson, toward the fields near a place called Saratoga, riding toward the very ground where he would fight the fight that saved his country and shatter, for the second time, the same leg he had already given it once. And so he came north in the closing weeks of that summer, up along the rough roads beside the great river, into a country of wooded hills and stump-dotted clearings, and the clean cold smell of pine and river water, to where the American army lay waiting on a stretch of high ground the soldiers had come to call Bemis Heights, rising steep from the water on one side so that the river road ran narrow beneath it, pinched thin between the foot of the bluff and the edge of the stream, and it was that narrow road, that single squeezed way south toward Albany, that the whole slow campaign of the autumn was really about. Because Burgoyne, a proud and clever and elegant man fond of fine dinners and grand confident plans, had to pass along that road to reach the city that was his goal, and the Americans had planted themselves squarely across it, up on the wooded heights, digging in behind long earthworks and felled trees and sharpened stakes that a quiet gifted Polish engineer in their service had laid out with real and patient skill, so that Burgoyne could not simply march past them, but would have to come at them. Uphill, through the trees, on ground they had chosen and he had not, and this modest wooded ridge above a river most of the world had never heard of was, though almost no one standing on it could have known it, the hinge on which the whole revolution was about to turn, and it was also the place where Benedict Arnold would give his leg to the cause a second time, the same lower left leg the winter cold of Quebec had already broken once. And the man who commanded that waiting army was a general named Horatio Gates, and I must draw the two of them side by side, gently and fairly, because so much of what happened grew out of the simple fact that they were, in their very natures, opposite kinds of men, and could not help grating against each other. The way two stones set in a wall that do not quite fit will grind no matter how carefully they are laid. For Gates was a careful man, a cautious man, an older soldier trained in the orderly European way, who kept good accounts and wrote good letters and was well liked by the politicians in Congress, and his whole instinct in that strong position was to wait, to sit tight behind the good earthworks and let the British come to him and break themselves against his defences, to let the cold and the hunger and the deep unfriendly wilderness do their patient work on Burgoyne's shrinking army. And there was real wisdom in that caution, and history would in the end prove it sound. But Arnold was made of altogether different weather, all forward motion and heat and appetite for the fight, a man who could not bear to sit still behind a wall while an enemy was within reach, who believed in his bones that battles were won by going out and seizing them, by striking first and striking hard, and so from almost the first day the two of them looked at the same ground and the same enemy and saw two entirely different things. Gates seeing a fortress to be patiently held, Arnold seeing a chance to be boldly taken. And Arnold had been given command of the left wing of the army, the wing nearest the open ground where the British would most likely try to come round, and among the men under him were some of the finest fighters in the whole camp. Hard, lean frontier riflemen, led by that same big, rough, gifted Virginian named Daniel Mo Wergan. Marksmen, who could bring a man down at a distance no ordinary musket could dream of, and Arnold looked at those men and at the ground, and every fibre of him wanted to go forward. And forward, in the end, is where it went, on a grey morning in the middle of September, on the 19th day of that month in 1777, when Burgoyne set his army in motion to feel his way toward the American position, moving in columns through the broken wooded country toward a small abandoned farm in a clearing, a place that has come down to us by the name of the family that had cleared it, Freeman's Farm, only a rough opening in the forest, a few fields and a cabin and the ragged edge of the trees, and it was there that the first great battle of Saratoga was fought. And Arnold, seeing the British moving, pressed and pressed to be let loose, urging Gates not to sit and wait to be struck, but to send men out to meet the enemy on the move, to hit the columns before they could mass, and Gates, cautious Gates, gave ground only grudgingly, but men did go forward, Morgan's riflemen first, slipping through the trees. And the fight they provoked around Freeman's Farm swelled through the long afternoon into something fierce and terribly costly. The riflemen picking off the British officers and gunners, the lines surging back and forth across the little clearing as the light failed. And when darkness came down and the firing guttered out, the British were left holding the bloodied ground. And so by the old reckoning the field was theirs, and the day was called a British day. But it was the kind of victory that ruins the victor. Because Burgoyne had bought that empty little clearing with a fearful price in his own men, hundreds of them, and they were men he could not replace, deep in a hostile country at the end of a long and fraying line. While the Americans could lose men and see the countryside send them more, and so the true winner of Freeman's Farm was the side that had lost the ground, and much of the credit for the aggression that made it so belonged by rights to Arnold and the men he had urged into the trees. And here the old sorrow of his life reached out and found him again in the middle of what should have been a shared triumph. Because when Gates sat down to write his report of the battle, the official account that would go to Congress and out into the newspapers, he wrote it so that Arnold's name was simply not there. No mention of the left wing or its commander, only Gates, and Gates's victory. And whether that was cold calculation or wounded pride, or the ordinary jealousy of a careful man toward a brilliant reckless one, we cannot fully know. But to Arnold, who had spent his whole life starving for exactly this, the omission landed like a slap, and he could not let it pass, and he went to Gates, and the two quarrelled bitterly, letters flying between two tents in the same camp, each man wounded and unwilling to bend, until at last Gates, who held the command, stripped Arnold of his troops, took his division from him, left him a general without a wing, and told him he was free to leave the army and go south to Philadelphia if he wished. And Arnold, furious and humiliated, actually took out a pass to go, and yet, so very like him, could not make himself leave, because a great battle was still surely coming, and Benedict Arnold could no more ride away from a coming battle than a moth can turn from a lamp, and so he stayed, with no command and no authority and no place, fuming in his tent, a caged fighting animal listening for the guns. And the days went by, more than 2 weeks of them, the two armies sitting in the autumn woods a little apart, digging deeper, waiting, while the balance tipped quietly against Burgoyne, because he was the one who could not simply wait, whose food was running short and whose horses were dying, who was hoping desperately for a relieving army from the south that would never truly come. So that with each silent day the trap around him drew tighter, and at last, in the early days of October, hungry and cornered, he decided he could sit no longer, and on the 7th of October he sent a strong column out to probe the American left, and with that the second great battle of Saratoga, the battle on Bemmy's Heights, began. And Arnold, remember, had no command at all now, no orders except the plain understanding that he was to stay back, out of the way, a general in disgrace with nothing to do but listen. And so he sat, and the guns began, and the sound of the fighting rolled back through the trees, the crash and the roll of it, and something in him simply could not bear it, could not hold still one moment longer while other men fought and fell within the sound of his own ears. And so he did a thing against all order and all propriety and all the plain instructions he had been given. He called for his horse and swung up into the saddle and rode out, alone and unauthorized and forbidden, straight toward the battle. And what happened then has come down as one of the great wild moments of the whole war, because the men out on that field knew him, and many of them loved him the way soldiers love a leader who has always gone forward with them and never once hung back, and when they saw him come riding out among them, hatless and shouting and afire, the general they thought had been taken from them. Something lifted in them, some contagious daring passed from him into the whole line, and they followed him, with no right to lead them at all, in charge after charge across that broken bloody ground, and the sheer reckless force of it began to bend and then to break the British line, and at the height of it he swung the attack against a strong point on the British right, an earthwork held by German troops that the soldiers called the Bremen Redoubt, and came at it headlong, and stormed it, driving his men in over the works, and with its fall the whole British position was cracked open, turned, made untenable, and the battle was decided in very large part by a general who was not supposed to be there at all. And it was there, at that very moment, at the storming of that redoubt, at the exact instant of the victory he had ridden out against all orders to seize, that the wound came, and here we go softly, for a musket ball struck him in the leg, the left leg, the same lower left leg the frozen assault on Quebec had shattered nearly 2 years before, broken now a second time, and in the same instant his horse was hit and went down heavily and fell upon that already broken leg and crushed it beneath its weight, pinning him on the ground he had just won, and there is a terrible precise irony in it that has never left the story, that the leg he gave the cause was broken in the very act of winning the battle that would win the war. The same limb maimed twice over in the service of a country whose gratitude he would spend the rest of his life feeling he had never been given, and men lifted the horse from him and carried him from the field, and the fight finished without him, but it was already, in truth, finished, because Burgoyne, his line broken, and his men bled white, could do nothing now but pull back what was left of his army into a tightening ring, and there, over the next few days, surrounded and starving and out of hope, on the 17th of October in 1777, he gave it up, and surrendered his whole army, the entire British force that had come marching so proudly down out of Canada. laid down before the Americans on that ridge above the Hudson, and it is difficult even now to say how large a thing that was, for the news of it ran out across the world, and when it reached the court of France, the old rival of Britain that had been watching this rebellion from a careful distance, wondering whether these ragged Americans could be worth the risk of an alliance, the surrender at Saratoga was the thing that decided them. The proof that the Americans could not only fight but win, could destroy a whole British army in the field, and on the strength of that proof France came into the war, openly, with her fleets and her armies and her money, and everything changed, and what had been a doomed-looking colonial revolt became a wide world-spanning contest. Britain could no longer be sure of winning, and it is no romance to say this was the turning point of the whole revolution, and that the battle had been turned, out on that field, in very large measure, by the reckless ride of a disgraced general with no command and a leg about to be shattered beneath a falling horse. And now comes the soft and bitter footnote, and I will tell it quietly, because it is the saddest part of the whole autumn, sadder than the wound. For when the glory of Saratoga was handed out, as glory always is after a great victory, it went in the main not to Arnold but to Gates, to the careful commanding general who had sat in his tent behind the earthworks, and Arnold's wild ride, the very thing that had broken the British line, was afterwards smoothed over and shaded down and half erased from the official telling, so that a man reading the tidy account later might scarcely know he had been there at all, and Arnold knew it, lying broken and helpless and unable to defend even the memory of what he had done, and it fed the old wound in him, the deep lifelong hunger to be seen and named and honoured. And where he lay through the long cold months that followed was in the town of Albany, in a bed he could not leave, in real and grinding pain, because the leg was a ruin, shattered and hideously slow to stop hurting, and the surgeons who tended it wanted to take it off, to amputate the smashed limb the way surgeons did in those days when a bone was that badly broken. But Arnold would not let them, refused them flatly, would not give up the leg, whether out of vanity or stubbornness or some deep refusal to be made less than whole we cannot say, and so he kept it, and it healed, but it healed badly, crooked and stiff and short, some 2 inches shorter than the other, so that when at last, after all those months on his back, he was able to rise and take up his life again, he did so as a visibly crippled man, a man who would limp heavily for the rest of his days, who would never again ride into a fight the way he had ridden into Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, whose whole fierce forward physical courage, the one great gift the world had never denied him, was now largely spent and closed off behind him. And he carried in himself, along with the shortened leg, the hardening belief that he had given this country everything, his fortune and his blood and his body twice over, and that in return it had slighted him, and let other men take the credit for his own hardest hours. And yet, and this too must be held beside all the rest, he was still a hero, still one of the most celebrated fighting generals in America, still a name that meant Quebec and Valcourt and now Saratoga, and there was one man above all who had never once wavered in his regard, who had watched Arnold's courage from the beginning with a kind of steady wondering admiration, and tried again and again to see him rightly rewarded, and that man was George Washington. And Washington, hearing that his wounded champion was slowly mending, wished to honour him and to shelter him, to give this maimed and deserving and difficult man a post worthy of his sacrifice, something that would not ask a shattered leg to charge up any more hillsides, a place of dignity and rest and reward. And so, as that hard winter wore towards spring, and the British made ready to give up the great city, they had been holding to the south, Washington's thoughts settled on exactly such a place, an honourable, comfortable, prominent command in the largest city in America, a city of fine mansions and fortunes and society and temptation, and, though no one could have guessed it then, of a certain clever and beautiful young woman whose household would draw him in. And the post Washington meant to give his wounded hero, out of the very kindness of his heart, was the military governorship of Philadelphia, And so the wounded champion came down at last from the long agony of his sickbed into the soft and dangerous comfort Washington had chosen for him, and in June of 1778 the British army that had held the city all winter marched away eastward toward New York, and the Americans came back in behind them, and at the head of that returning tide, riding slowly because he could no longer do anything quickly, came Benedict Arnold, the hero of the North, now the master of the largest and richest city in America. And I want you to picture him as he came, because the picture holds the whole of the sadness about to unfold. A man not yet 40, though older than his years. A famous man, a brave man, whose name was still spoken with real warmth in the taverns and parlours, and yet a man who could not mount a horse without help, and could not walk across a room without the lurch and the wince of that lower left leg, so that the glory rode in on a body that would not stop reminding him, at every single stride, of what the glory had cost him, and there is no villain in this part of the story. I want to say that softly and clearly, there is only a proud and injured man being set down in exactly the wrong place, in a house of luxury with his honour unhealed and his purse quite empty, and being asked by a country that had already taken so much from him and thanked him so little to be patient a while longer, and patience was the one virtue this brave man had never truly learned. And the house he took for himself was the finest in the city, the great pen mansion the British General Howe had lived in while he held the town, and Arnold set about living in a way a plain New England man of his beginnings had perhaps always secretly longed to live, with a coach and liveried servants and a great table and fine wine, and the whole glittering apparatus of a man determined to be. Seen as great, and he opened his doors and moved through the drawing-rooms of the city's first families as an equal or better, and it was all far beyond what his means could carry, because the truth underneath the guilt was that Arnold was not a rich man at all, but a man deep in debt and getting deeper, who had poured his own fortune into the war and never been repaid, whose Canada accounts still sat unsettled in the ledgers of a Congress that seemed to suspect him of cheating rather than credit him with spending his own money in its service. And so here was the trap. A man who felt the country owed him a fortune and would not pay it, living like a lord on money he did not have, needing desperately to find some way to make the money his pride insisted he was owed and his creditors insisted he produce. And so he did what men in his position have always done, and what was not in those loose, unregulated days even clearly against any law, though it hovered always in the grey country at the edge of honour. He used his office to make money. He turned the powers of the military governor toward the filling of his own empty purse. And the schemes were many and tangled, and I will not weary you with all of them, but the shape of them matters. That he went into private business ventures on the side while he governed, quiet partnerships and speculations, taking secret shares in trading voyages and using here and there the authority of his position to smooth the way for his own profit. And the one that would bite him hardest was a matter of a ship, for when he first took command of the city he issued an order closing the shops until it could be sorted out which goods belonged to loyal citizens, and which to those who had fled with the British, a sensible sounding order, except that while everyone else's shops stood closed, Arnold himself, through his partners, was quietly buying up goods for his own profit, and there was a ship, the Charming Nancy, in which he had secretly taken a financial interest, and he granted it a pass under his official signature to bring its cargo through the lines, protecting his own investment with the stroke of a governor's pen. And later, when that cargo needed moving overland, he used the public wagons of the state of Pennsylvania to haul his own private goods, and you can see, even half asleep, how such a thing would look to hard, suspicious eyes. The great general enriching himself with the state's own wagons, while ordinary shopkeepers sat idle under his order. And there were hard, suspicious eyes upon him, plenty of them, because Philadelphia in those years was a city boiling with fierce radical politics. Its new revolutionary government made up of ardent men who distrusted anything that smelled of wealth and privilege, and who looked at this limping general in his borrowed mansion with his coach and his servants and his grand dinners and his loyalist friends, and did not see a wounded hero at all, but exactly the kind of high-living, self-serving grandee their whole revolution was supposed to sweep away. And chief among those hard eyes was the president of the state's executive council, a lawyer named Joseph Reed, a sharp, determined, unforgiving man, who came to watch Arnold with a cold gathering fury, collecting the stories, the ship and the pass, the shops and the wagons, the private deals, the whole pattern of a man he was sure was using his public office for private gain. And beneath the specific charges ran a deeper anger at the man's very manner, his hauteur, his coldness toward the civil authority, his friendliness toward the old loyalist families the radicals despised. For Arnold had no patience for politicians, thought civilians who had risked nothing had no business judging men who had bled, and let it show, and so made, without quite meaning to. An enemy who would hound him without rest, and the quarrel grew and hardened all through that year into a grinding feud of pamphlets and complaints to Congress, and Arnold felt it as a persecution, hunted by small jealous men who had never faced a musket, so that the old sense of being wronged now had a fresh and daily wound to feed on. And it was into this same tangle of debt and grievance and grand living and gathering enmity that the other great thread of the chapter came softly winding. Because in the drawing rooms of the city, among those very loyalist-leaning families, Arnold met and began to court a young woman named Margaret Shippen, though everyone called her Peggy, the youngest daughter of Edward Shippen, a cautious, prosperous, well-connected judge whose family stood near the very top of Philadelphia society. An old genteel family that had, during the long British occupation, opened its doors quite naturally to the British officers who were then the masters of the town, so that its daughters had danced and flirted with the young men in red coats, and Peggy was the flower of that house. Truly beautiful by every account, and more than beautiful, clever, charming, well-read, ambitious in the quiet way intelligent women had to be, and she was very young, not yet 20, less than half the age of the limping widower general who came calling on her. For Arnold was 38 now, and broken in body, with 3 sons already growing up, and he laid siege to a girl of 18 with all the ardour and stubbornness he had once brought to the walls of Quebec, writing her letters of extravagant devotion, refusing to be discouraged, and in time he won her family's consent, and in April of 1779 they were married in the Shippen house. The great scarred hero, and the lovely young girl, and he had to be supported during the ceremony because his leg could not bear him through it, a servant standing ready to hold him up. And I want to linger a moment on a name that passed through that same charmed loyalist circle, because it matters so much to everything coming, for among the British officers who had made themselves agreeable in those Shippen drawing rooms during the occupation, among the charming young men in red who had danced with Peggy, there had been one in particular, a captain, an unusually gifted and delightful young man named John Ander, witty, artistic, a sketcher of portraits and a writer of light verses, a favourite of every hostess, and this Ander had known Peggy Shippen well in that gay winter, had been part of her world, and when the British marched away he marched away with them, back to New York, where he was rising fast in the confidence of the British command. And so there was already, before ever the treason was dreamed of, a thin bright thread of acquaintance running from the parlour where Arnold courted his bride straight across the lines to the young officer in New York who would one day come up a dark river to meet him. And history has wondered ever since, without any way of knowing for certain, how much the lovely well-connected young wife, with her loyalist family and her fond memory of the British officers and her own sharp intelligence, had to do with turning her husband's bitterness toward its terrible outlet, and we cannot say. The evidence is thin, and the heart of a marriage is the most hidden room there. But we know that after the wedding the debts pressed harder than ever, for a young and beautiful wife accustomed to the best did nothing to make a lavish household cheaper, and the persecution only sharpened, and somewhere in that spring the thing that had been summing itself up in the dark of Arnold's soul for so many years finally reached its total. And here, softly, is that arithmetic, not as an excuse, for there is no excuse and he would earn none, but as an understanding, the sad completed sum of a life pushed until it broke the wrong way, the promotions withheld and lesser men raised over him, the accounts left unpaid, and himself made to feel a suspected cheat. The leg given twice, and the glory of Saratoga handed to another. The mounting debt, the civilian politicians hounding him, the marriage into a circle whose sympathies leaned quietly the other way, and through it all a wound to his vanity so deep and so long unhealed that it had festered into a cold conviction that the country he had bled for was ungrateful and beneath him, and that a man so ill-used owed it nothing more. And once a man has truly come to believe he owes nothing to the thing he swore to serve, the last wall is down, and everything after is only a matter of price. And so, that spring, quietly, in secret, through intermediaries and in a cipher agreed between them, Benedict Arnold opened a correspondence with the enemy, reached across the lines to the British command in New York, to Sir Henry Clinton, the commander-in-chief there, and did it through that same courteous gifted hand, John Ander, now risen to be Clinton's adjutant-general, his trusted aid in matters of intelligence, and the letters that began to pass, disguised, coded, carried by go-betweens, were the opening of a long, slow bargain, for Arnold offered what he had to offer, which was himself, his position, the secrets of the American army that he was so well placed to know, and asked in return what he felt he was owed: money, a great sum to settle his ruin, and a commission in the British army, a rank, a place of honour among the very men he had fought so hard against. And it did not happen all at once. It was only talk at first, only feeling out across the dark whether the two sides could come to terms, the British wanting to be sure they were not led into a trap, and that whatever Arnold delivered would be worth the extraordinary sums he asked, and Arnold wanting the price high enough to be worth the whole ruin of his name. And here the two threads of that year pulled the knot tight, because through the summer and autumn the wheels of his other troubles ground on, for the Pennsylvania Council under Reed had at last pressed their formal charges, referred in the end to a military court-martial, and Arnold in his pride did not shrink from it, but demanded it, certain that a court of soldiers would clear him and shame his civilian tormentors. And yet the trial was delayed and delayed, month after month, so that the thing dragged on into the winter, a long humiliating limbo in which his honour hung unresolved and his enemies' charges stood unrefuted. And it was through exactly those months, you understand, that the secret letters were passing quietly to New York, so that the two halves of him ran on side by side. The injured patriot loudly demanding his trial and vindication, and the secret traitor quietly negotiating his price, the same man, in the same house, at the same desk perhaps, doing both at once. And when the court-martial finally came, early in 1780, it did more or less what Arnold had expected, cleared him of the serious accusations, and convicted him only on two minor counts, the ship's pass and the use of the public wagons, and it might have ended as the vindication he wanted, except for the sentence, because the court decreed that he should receive a reprimand, a formal rebuke, and that it should be delivered by the commander-in-chief himself, by George Washington, and that one thing landed on Arnold's pride like a brand pressed to the skin. For of all the men in the world, Washington was the one Arnold revered, the one whose good opinion he still, even now, even in the midst of his secret treason, truly wanted. And to be publicly rebuked by that man was a wound he could not bear, and Washington did the thing as gently as it could be done, wrapped the rebuke in praise, reminded the army of Arnold's great and gallant services, and yet it did not matter how gentle it was, because to a man in Arnold's state even a feather laid on a raw burn is agony. And he took it not as the mild correction it was, but as the last entry in the long ledger, the man he most admired turning against him, thanking his broken body with a public scolding. And whatever thread of loyalty still held, that reprimand was very near to cutting the last of it. And so by the spring of that year the whole slow slide was all but complete, the negotiations carrying on in their cipher, the price still being haggled, and Arnold now fully and coldly committed in his own heart, no longer a wavering man being tempted, but a decided man looking for his opportunity. And the only question left was the merchant's question. What did he have that was worth enough to sell? What could he deliver so great, so devastating to the American cause, that the British would pay the enormous price he meant to charge, and as his eye moved over the whole map of the war it settled, slowly and surely, on a single place, on a fortress high on a bend of the Hudson River that guarded the great waterway, the most important single point in all of America. And its name was West Point, and Arnold understood. With the cold, clear eye of a man who had once stormed such places himself, that if a man could hand West Point to the British, quietly, from the inside, he would hand them very nearly the war itself. And so through that summer he set himself to the last piece of the design, to get himself placed in command of it, and he angled for it, and pressed for it softly through his friends, and let it be known that his wounded leg made him unfit now for the field, but fit still for a quiet fixed command, and Washington, still wishing only to shelter and honour his crippled hero, still trusting him utterly, still knowing nothing of the letters going to New York, in the summer of 1780 gave him what he asked, and made Benedict Arnold the commander of West Point. And so the trap was set, and the fortress that guarded the whole American cause was placed, all unknowing, into the hands of the one man who had already sold it. And it is worth resting softly on what West Point was, a great stony bend in the Hudson, where the water narrows and turns, and whoever held that bend held the river, and whoever held the river held the line between New England and the rest of the colonies, for the Hudson ran like a blade up into the heart of the country. And if the British could once get their ships the whole length of it, they could cut the young nation cleanly in two, each half too weak to save the other. And so the Americans had laboured for years to make that narrows unpassable, had raised batteries and redoubts on the high ground, had built a chain of forts stepped up the hillsides, and had stretched across the river itself, from shore to shore, an enormous iron chain, each link as long as a man's forearm, floated on great logs to snag and stop any ship that dared the passage. And all of it together was the lock upon the door of the continent. And Washington called it the key to America, and now the key was in the pocket of the one man in all the army who meant to sell it. And the shape of the bargain was this, that Arnold, once master of the fortress, would not defend it but quietly betray it from within, would scatter its garrison on errands and false alarms, so that when the moment came the walls would be thinly manned, would let the works fall softly into disrepair, and leave a certain path undefended. So that a British force coming suddenly up the river would meet not a fortress bristling and ready, but one half asleep, its defenders gone, its chain able to be slipped and its gates all but open. And for handing over this hinge of the whole war Arnold asked near £20,000 in the money of that day, a great fortune, enough to bury forever the debts and the shame. And asked as well a general's commission under the crown, so that he should not merely be paid, but be made again into a soldier. And there was folded into the bargain a prize so large the plotters scarcely dared name it, for Washington himself was expected to pass that way on his own quiet rounds, and if the timing fell as they hoped, the surrender of the fort might deliver into British hands not only the river and the chain and the garrison, but the commander of the whole American cause, and with him, very possibly, the war entire, so that the revolution might have ended there, on that grey bend of water, not with a battle but with a betrayal. And all of it moved forward in the slow, muffled, careful way of such things, through go-betweens who carried folded papers, through a private cipher in which ordinary words of trade stood in for forts and troops and money, Arnold writing as a merchant with goods to sell, and a British answering as merchants ready to buy, and for a long while it went on in this bloodless paper fashion, each side hidden behind its screen of code, but a bargain so large and so grave could not in the end be closed entirely by letter, and there came the fateful decision, pressed for by the British, that the two parties must at last meet in person, face to face and in the flesh, to settle the final particulars that no cipher could safely carry, the exact plans of the works, the exact hour, the exact undefended path. And so the paper war of the study gave way to a meeting in the dark, and it is here that the young man enters, John Ander, the charming, gifted, well-liked British officer who had known lovely Peggy in the bright days of the Philadelphia occupation, and had risen now to be Adjutant General to Sir Henry Clinton in New York, a trusted man, fond of music and drawing and verse. and it was Ander who was chosen to go up the river and meet the traitor and bring back the keys of the plot. And so, in the 3rd week of September, a British sloop of war called the Vulture came up the Hudson as far as she dared and lay at anchor in the dark water below the American lines, and from her deck, on the night of the meeting, Ander was carried ashore by boat to a lonely spot on the western bank among the trees at the water's edge, and there in the blackness the two men met at last, the American general who was selling his country and the British officer who had come to buy it, and they talked through the night, low and long, the plans passing between them, the maps of the works and the placings of the guns and the numbers of the men, everything a captor would need to know, and the hours slipped away until it was too late, until the boatman would not carry Ander back out to the sloop before the coming of the light, and the dawn came, as dawns do, patient and inevitable, and found the British Adjutant General still on the wrong side of the water, behind the American lines, with the whole of the plot in his possession, and no ship to carry him home. And then a second small thing went wrong, one of those quiet turnings that decide great matters, for while Ander waited out the day, hidden and anxious, the Americans on a point downstream ran out a cannon or two, and began almost idly to fire upon the sloop where she lay so boldly close, and the shots told, and the Vulture, to spare herself, weighed and dropped away down river, out of reach, taking with her Anders one easy road of return, so that the young man was left stranded ashore, behind the lines, with the incriminating papers upon him, and no way back, except the hard and dangerous way, by land, through the American-held country, down toward the British posts near the city, past sentries and patrols and suspicious eyes. And so Ander did the thing that would undo him, the thing that turns a captured soldier into a hanged spy. For to make the overland journey he put off the scarlet coat of a British officer and dressed instead in plain civilian clothes, a common coat, a round hat, so that he might pass unremarked, and he took the folded papers Arnold had given him, the plans of West Point in Arnold's own unmistakable hand, and rather than destroy them or trust them to memory, he tucked them down inside his stocking, beneath his boot, against the sole of his foot, and he carried a pass Arnold had written out with his own pen, permitting one John Anderson, the false name Ander travelled under, to go freely about the lines, and armed with that borrowed name and that folded lie against his foot, the young man set off south on a borrowed horse, alone to run the gauntlet of the last few miles, and for a long stretch the pass and the false name carried him through, and it seemed he might yet come clear. But on the 23rd of September, near the little village of Tarrytown, still short of the British lines, on the shifting lawless neutral ground where men of both sides and of no side roamed, 3 ordinary militiamen named John Paulding and David Williams and Isaac Van Wart, who were out watching the roads, stepped from the trees and stopped the lone rider, and here everything hung on a thread, for Ander, uncertain who they were, spoke too soon and guessed wrong, and let slip words that made them doubt him, and instead of showing his pass at once and riding on he tangled himself, and the 3 men grew suspicious and would not let him go, and they searched him down to the skin, and there at last, drawn out from inside his stocking beneath his boot, they found the papers, the plans of West Point, the numbers and the works and the weaknesses of the great fortress, and though these plain countrymen could not have grasped the full enormity of what they held, they knew enough to know that no honest traveller carried the secrets of a fort hidden in his boot, and Ander, seeing himself found out, offered them his horse and his watch, and a great sum of money, anything, to let him go. And it is one of the small, quiet glories of this sad story that the 3 men would not be bought, that they held their prisoner fast, and took him and his hidden papers to the nearest American officer, and would not be turned. And now the trap that had been so long and carefully built for another closed, slowly and terribly, upon its own maker. For the captured papers passed up the chain of command toward Washington himself, and yet, by one of those cruel confusions, a message was also sent in the first tangle up toward West Point, toward Arnold, meaning to inform the fort's own commander that a man taken on the road had been carrying his papers, so that the very warning that should have hanged, the traitor raced instead straight into. his hands and gave him the one thing a doomed man most needs, a few hours' start. And this is how we come. At the very last, back to the beginning, back to the scene with which this whole long night opened, the small boat on the wide dark river, the man being rowed out toward the enemy ship, the scene we did not understand then, and understand now. For on the morning of the 25th of September, at his headquarters in a pleasant house below the fortress, Arnold sat at breakfast with several of his officers, young aides of Washington's among them, and Washington himself was close, very close, expected at any moment, riding down from his inspection of the works to join his general at the table. So close that the household was making ready to receive him, and into that ordinary morning there came a messenger with a letter. And Arnold opened it, and read that the man calling himself John Anderson had been taken upon the road, and that the papers had been found, and that they were on their way to Washington, and he understood in a single silent instant that everything was known, or would be within the hour, that the whole vast structure of the plot had fallen, that Ander was taken, and his own hand upon the papers plain for all to see, and that the commander he had betrayed was even now approaching the door, and he did not cry out and he did not faint, he only rose from the table, quietly, saying some small thing about being needed at the fort, and went up the stairs to the room where Peggy was, and told her in a few low words that all was discovered, and that he must fly at once or die, and then he came down, and mounted a horse, and rode hard down the steep path to the landing, where his own barge waited with its oarsman, and stepped into the boat, that small boat on the dark water, and bade the men row, telling them to hurry them. That he was going down under a flag to the British sloop, and would return, and they bent to their oars, not knowing, and carried him out onto the broad grey reach of the Hudson, down toward where the Vulture lay, and so the general was rowed away from his command and his country and his name, out across the cold flat water in the morning light, to the enemy's ship, and climbed aboard. And was gone, and that at the very last is the meaning of the rowboat, the picture we began with and could not read, a man carried out over dark water away from everything, not towards some adventure, but away from the ruin of a life, fleeing across a river into the arms of the people he had sold his honour to, alone. And behind him the trap sprang shut upon the empty air where he had been, for Washington came, at last, and found no Arnold, and then the papers reached him, and the whole black truth of it opened before the commander in the space of a single morning, that the man he had trusted and defended and forgiven had meant to sell him the key of the war, and very likely his own person into the bargain. And Washington, who was not a man given to loud grief, is remembered to have taken it very quietly and very hard, standing amid the wreckage of the discovered plot and saying, in words that carry the whole weariness of that hour, "Whom can we trust now?" A plain small question with no bottom to it. And upstairs there was Peggy, and here the story turns strange and pitiable, for the young wife, left behind in the fled traitor's house, gave herself over to a wild performance of hysterical innocence, raving and crying out that her child would be murdered, seeming to lose her very reason before the hard soldiers who came to her, Washington and young Hamilton among them, and these men, who could believe many things of Arnold now, but not such a thing of a lovely half-crazed young mother, were wholly deceived, and pitied her, and let her go to her father and to safety, never guessing, as many now believe, that she had known the whole of the plot from within it, had carried letters and stood at the very centre of it beside her husband, and had put on her madness as deliberately as Ander had put on his plain coat, and so she too passed clean through the closing trap, by a softer and stranger door. But there was one who did not pass through, and it was the young man, Ander, and his fate is the long grief of this whole story. For Ander was carried to the American camp at Tappan, and there brought before a board of officers who had to weigh what he was, and the hard truth of the law of war was against him. For a soldier taken in his uniform is a prisoner and is spared, but a soldier taken behind the enemy's lines in disguise, in plain clothes, under a false name, carrying hidden papers, is by every usage of that age a spy, and a spy is hanged, and Ander, who bore himself through it all with a grace and honesty that won the hearts of the very men who had to judge him, did not deny what he had done, but only asked, with great dignity, that since he must die, he might die the death of a soldier by the bullet, and not the death of a common felon at the end of a rope. And there was even a quiet, unofficial suggestion floated toward the British that Enda might be spared if only they would hand back Arnold to be hanged in his place. But this the British could not do. For to surrender a man who had come over to them would be to tell every future traitor that the crown would not protect its own, and so Anda's fate was fixed, and on the 2nd of October in 1780 at Tappen, the young adjutant general was led out to the gallows before the gathered army, and he met it, all agreed, with a composure that broke the hearts of the men who watched. Arranging the cloth over his own eyes with his own hands, asking only that the bystanders would bear him witness that he met his fate like a brave man, and then he died, and there was scarcely a dry eye in the whole camp, and hardened soldiers wept for the enemy spy they had been forced to hang, and this is the cruellest arithmetic of the whole affair, that the brave and blameless-seeming young man died the death, while the man whose treason had put the rope around his neck sat safe and dry a few miles off behind the British lines, alive, and would go on living for 20 years more, and the grief and anger of it gathered like a stain around the name of Arnold, and never afterward washed out, so that for generations the two names would be spoken together, Anda pitied and Arnold cursed. And Arnold, for his part, was safe, and had what he had bargained for, or something of it, for the British made him a brigadier general in the army of the king, and paid him money, though not the whole great sum he had dreamed of. For the plot had failed, and West Point had not fallen, and a bargain that fails is worth less than one that succeeds, and so he was paid as one pays for spoiled goods, a lesser figure than the £20,000 he had reached for. And yet, from the very first hour he was a man alone, in a way that no money and no commission could mend, for the British officers who now had to serve beside him did not love him and did not trust him, and could not help knowing in their hearts that a man who had sold one master would as easily sell another, that treason once done is a thing that clings. And they were courteous to him and used him, but did not take him in, and behind him, up and down the length of the colonies he had abandoned, his name was already curdling into the thing it has stayed ever since. A word for the deepest kind of betrayal, spat and burned in effigy, and taught to children as the very shape of what a man must never be, so that he had gained a general's rank without an army's love, and gold without honour, and safety without a country. And so the man who had once bled so freely for the 13 colonies was sent, in the last cold turning of the year, out of the safety of British New York down toward the country he had helped to make war upon it, dressed now in the scarlet coat of the crown, a brigadier general of King George, with none at all of the warmth that a general is usually given by the men who follow him. And there is something so heavy and so quietly sorrowful in that turn of the road that we shall go through it slowly, at a great and merciful distance, because none of this can reach you now. It is all more than 200 years spent and gone. For the British, having bought this famous soldier at so great a price, meant now to use him and to test him, to see whether the loyalty they had paid for was real, and there is no crueler way to test a turned man than to send him back against his own, and that is exactly what was done. For in the deep of that winter Arnold was given a force of some 1,600 men and a small fleet and sent south to Virginia to carry fire and the sword into the soft rich heart of a state that had sent so many of its sons to the cause. And he went, and did the work well, as he did all military work well, for whatever else had failed in him, the old hard competence never failed, the eye for ground and speed and the weak place in a line. And he drove his little fleet up the wide brown river the Virginians called the James, striking faster than the militia could gather to stop him, and in the first days of the new year he came to Richmond, the little capital town on its hills above the water, and took it almost without a fight, and burned it, or burned much of it, the warehouses and the stores of tobacco and powder and arms, the very sinews of the war, sending up a great black smoke that could be seen for miles. And the young governor of Virginia, a tall red-haired man of about Arnold's own age named Thomas Jefferson, who had written only a few years before the very words that had set the whole quarrel alight, that all men are created equal, had to gather what papers he could and ride hard out of his own capital to keep from being taken by the traitor, and could only look back from the far hills at the smoke rising over Richmond and know that the man who lit it had once been the finest fighting general the cause possessed. And through that winter and into the spring Arnold ranged up and down the Tidewater country, raiding and burning and harrying, taking the tobacco that was Virginia's money and the mills that were its bread, a hard, thorough professional cruelty carried out by a man who knew exactly how to hurt a country, because he had spent years learning how to defend one, and the Virginians came to hate his name with a special heat. And Jefferson, calm, cool Jefferson, put out the word that there would be a great reward in money, and land to any band of bold men who could steal into the British camp and carry Benedict Arnold off alive, so that he might be brought to justice before the country he had betrayed. And men did try, and none quite managed it for Arnold, who knew better than any man alive what capture would mean. Kept a loaded pistol close and a fast boat closer, and slept, they say, like a hunted thing. And here is one of those small dark stories that have gathered around his name, given softly, as a thing men have long told rather than a thing we can prove, that George Washington himself gave a quiet instruction concerning the traitor, that if ever Arnold should be taken, the wounded leg, the one shattered at Quebec and again at Saratoga, the leg given so bravely to the country in its 2 hardest hours, should be cut away and buried with full military honours as the leg of a hero, and all the rest of the man above that scarred knee should be hanged, plainly as a traitor. And whether Washington ever truly said it, or whether it was only the bitter poetry of a grieving army, we cannot. No, but hold it a moment before you drift, because in that one dark image the whole of the man is caught as in a drop of amber, the hero and the traitor in the very same body, the honoured leg and the hanged man. But the cruellest of all his services was not in far Virginia among strangers, it was closer to home, so close he could have smelled the salt of it from his boyhood, for in the early autumn of that same year, on the 6th of September, in 1781, Arnold was sent to raid the coast of his own Connecticut, the very shore where he had grown from a boy into a man. Against the town of New London and its little sister across the river at Groton, ground he knew in his bones, for he had been born and raised only a short way off, and had spent his young manhood as a trader out of these very waters, and now he came back to it in a scarlet coat at the head of the king's soldiers to burn it, and burn it he did, for New London was a nest of the American privateers. And the torches were put to the warehouses and the ships and the houses, until much of the town he had known as a young man was a sheet of flame, the smoke rolling out over the same grey water he had learned to sail as a boy, a man setting fire to the country of his own beginning. And across the river, at a small earthen fort called Fort Griswold above Groton, the thing happened that would stain his name most darkly of all, for a small garrison of Connecticut militia, perhaps 150 farmers and townsmen, held that little fort and would not give it up, and the British stormed it in a hard, bitter fight, and took heavy losses in the taking, and when at last the defenders were overwhelmed and laid down their arms and surrendered, as the laws of war allowed them to do, expecting the quarter that surrendered men are owed, they were not given it, and instead there was a slaughter of men who had already given up. The American commander Ledyard cut down, it is said, with his own surrendered sword, and dozens of the militia bayoneted after the fighting was done, so that Fort Griswold became a name spoken with horror up and down New England, a massacre, and though Arnold himself was across the river directing the burning, and did not with his own hand do the killing, still it was his raid, his command, his name upon the whole cruel day, and the country never forgave him for it, and it was the last thing he ever did as a soldier, this burning of his own boyhood coast, and the blood spilled at the little fort above it. And the strangest, saddest thing of all is that even as the smoke of New London was rising, the whole war, for which he had thrown away his honour, was already ending, far to the south, for down in Virginia, at a little tobacco port called Yorktown. The main British army under Lord Cornwallis was even then being penned against the sea by Washington and the French, and within a few weeks that army would lay down its arms, and the long war would be, for all that mattered, over and lost. The very cause Arnold had judged to be failing, and had abandoned and betrayed for money, and rank was about to win after all, so that his great gamble, the thing for which he had sold everything, turned out to have been a wager laid upon the losing side at the very moment it became the winning one, and there is a bitterness in that so deep and quiet that one hardly knows what to do with it, except to feel how little any of us can see of the shape of things while we are inside them. And so, with the war lost and his usefulness spent, there was nothing left for Arnold in America, only the hatred of a whole people, and late in 1781 he took ship for England, and with him went Peggy, his young wife, who had stood by him through the plot and the flight and the exile, and their small children, sailing away east across the winter Atlantic toward London. Toward what Arnold must have imagined would be honour and command, and a great man's welcome at last, and this is where the long, slow, sad anticlimax of his life begins. 20 years of it. A quieter grief than the loud griefs before, for the welcome he dreamed of never truly came. The king received him, and was kind enough, and for a little while the newspapers took notice of him, and he walked in the parks and was pointed out. But London society, that cool, watchful world, did not warm to him, and could not, for there is a thing even the men who buy a traitor cannot help feeling toward the traitor they have bought. That a man who has once betrayed the side he was born to might, given cause, betray them too, that a turned coat can turn again, and the very British officers whom Arnold had crossed over to join would not take his hand, would not sit with him, for to them he was the man who had sent poor young Major Arnder, their own beloved Arnder, to the gallows in his place, and that grief they laid at his door and never lifted, so that he found himself in London, as he had found himself everywhere in these last years, a man paid but not honoured, used but not loved, welcomed at the door and cold-shouldered in the room, and the field command he longed for never came. They left him on the shelf with his half-pay and his pension, an ageing soldier with nothing left to do, and a man like Arnold could not simply sit and be idle, for the same restless driving energy that had climbed the mill-wheel as a boy still burned in him with nowhere to go, and so he threw himself into schemes and ventures, went back to the sea and the trade he had known as a young man, and in the 1790s took himself off to the West Indies to try his hand again at commerce and at privateering in the new wars then breaking out as revolution swept through France. And it went badly, as things seemed always now to go badly for him. For at one point he was seized by the French revolutionaries at Guadeloupe, suspected of being a British spy, which in a sense he was, and came within a hair's breadth of being hanged there in the Caribbean, the same rope that had waited somewhere just behind him ever since the rowboat on the Hudson, and only by a bold, desperate escape by night to a British ship did he save his neck one last time, and came home to England with little to show but the memory of the gallows and a growing pile of debts. For the debts were always there, closing in, patient and quiet, the debts that had haunted him since the grand living days in Philadelphia, and they never really left him. They gathered around his last years like a cold tide coming slowly up a beach. And through all of it, through the cold welcome and the failed ventures and the near hanging and the mounting debts and the slow bitter dwindling of a great fierce life into disappointment, there was one steady warmth that did not fail, and it was Peggy, his wife, who loved him and stood by him to the very end, that clever, graceful, faithful woman who had followed him down into infamy and exile and never turned from him, but kept his house and raised his children and managed his tangled money with a shrewd, steady hand, and believed in him when almost no one else in the world would. And their children grew, and several of the sons went for soldiers themselves, honourable officers in the king's army, serving with credit in far corners of the empire, so that the blood carried on and made its own quieter, cleaner name well away from the shadow of the father. And at the last, worn out before his time by a life that had burned so hot for so long, by the old wounds and the gout and the dropsy and the asthma that made his breathing hard, and worn out too in the spirit by all the years of being the man nobody quite wanted, Benedict Arnold came to his death in London in a house on Gloucester Place on the 14th of June in 1801, at the age of 60, quietly, in his bed, with Peggy near. Far across the ocean from the country of his birth and the country of his betrayal both. And there is a gentleness we can allow ourselves in the very picture of it, that whatever he had done, and whatever he had become, at the end he was only an old, tired, sick man in a bed, his fierce fires guttering low, his loyal wife beside him, slipping away as all of us must slip away. And there is a story told about that deathbed, given very softly, as a thing long believed rather than proven, that as he lay dying he asked to be dressed once more in the old uniform he had worn when he was a hero, the blue and buff of the Continental Army, the coat of the country he had fought for and then forsaken, and that he said, or is said to have said, something to the effect that God might forgive him for ever having put on any other, and whether those words were truly spoken, or only laid upon his memory afterward by a world that wanted his story to end in one clean note of regret, no one can say, but it is a tender thing to imagine the old traitor at the very end reaching back across all the wreckage of his life for the one time when he had been what he was born to be, a brave man on the right side, and wishing, too late, that he had never left it. And they buried him quietly, without any great mourning, in the crypt of a small church across the river, St. Mary's at Battersea. A modest resting place for a man who had once dreamed of glory, far from Norwich and New Haven and the Hudson and Saratoga, and Peggy, faithful to the last, outlived him only by a few years, dying young herself of a slow illness, but not before she had, with her careful patient hands, paid off the tangled debts he left behind, so that his name at least should not be a debtor's name, one last quiet loyalty from the one person who never left him. And now, having walked the whole long life through, from the daring boy on the mill wheel to the old man dying in the grey London house, we come at last, gently, to the question we set out at the very beginning to answer. How does a man give a country his leg and then try to sell it his soul? How do the hero and the traitor live in one body? And the answer, I think, is not the gasp we might expect, not some hidden rottenness that was there all along, but something far quieter and sadder and more human, that the very same qualities which made him the hero were the qualities that made him the traitor, that they were never two different men at all, but always one, and that the thing which lifted him up was the very thing that brought him down, for think of what made him great. It was pride, a fierce, burning, magnificent pride that could not bear to be beaten, that drove him up the mill wheel as a reckless boy and through the frozen wilderness to Quebec, when wiser men turned back and uncommanded into the guns at Bemis Heights. And that same pride, that same fierce hunger to be first and to be seen and to be honoured, was a glory on the battlefield and a poison everywhere else. For a pride that great cannot survive being slighted, and Arnold was slighted again and again, made to feel that the country he had bled for did not see him and would not pay its debt of honour to him, and to a cooler man those slights might have been bearable, but to a man made all of pride they were unendurable, a slow drip of acid on the one thing he could not do without. The sense of his own worth acknowledged by others, and around that wounded pride the other things gathered, the money troubles that never left him, the whisper of a clever young wife with her own loyalties, the honest sense that the cause might well be lost, and the ordinary human genius for telling oneself that what one wants to do is also the reasonable thing to do, and all of it together worked upon that great proud heart, not all at once but slowly, one small drop at a time, the way water hollows a stone, until one day the unthinkable had quietly become the thinkable, and then the planned, and then the done, and no one, least of all himself perhaps, could say exactly where along that slow road the hero had turned into the traitor. And that is the truest and gentlest answer we can give, that he was not a monster and not a saint, but a man, a large, fierce, gifted, wounded man, in whom the very fire that made him brave made him unable to bear being small, and if there is a lesson in it, it is a tender and humbling one, that the qualities we are proudest of are very often the same that will undo us if we do not watch them. And that a life is not lost in one great crash, but in a long series of small daily choices, each one small enough to excuse, met a little badly, one after another, until the sum of them is a ruin. And so we come to the two quiet monuments that hold his memory now, out on the old battlefield at Saratoga, where his best and last true glory was won. For there stands a small stone monument that shows not a man at all, but only a boot. A soldier's left boot carved in stone, set there to honour the leg that was wounded in that battle. And the inscription praises the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, gravely wounded on that spot, and winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the Revolution, and it names, in all its words of praise, no name at all. It honours the leg, and will not speak the man, so that a visitor might stand before it, and never know whose brilliant, wounded, honoured leg it was. And not far off there is a tall monument to the great victory, with niches in its sides for the 4 generals who won it, and 3 of the niches hold their statues, 3 honoured men standing in their bronze, and the 4th niche, the place where the 4th general should stand, the general who did more than any of them to win that day, stands empty, a smooth blank space where a man should be, because the country could not bring itself to carve his figure there, and could not quite bring itself to leave him out of the story altogether, and so it left, instead, that eloquent emptiness, that silence in the shape of a man, and there could be no truer pair of monuments for him than those 2. The boot that honours a leg and will not name him, and the empty niche where his name should be, for between them they hold the whole of it, the bravery that was real and the betrayal that was real, the honour that was earned and the honour that was thrown away, the hero and the traitor caught forever in a boot of stone and a space of air. And now, gently, we may let him go, this large and troubled and deeply human man, and lay his long, sad, tangled story down. The way you might lay a heavy coat down at the door at the end of a cold day, glad to be rid of the weight of it, and let it rest there in the dark of the hall while you go on into the warm, quiet room. For it is not our weight to carry tonight. His pride and his wounds and his ruin, all of it is more than 200 years laid to rest in the crypt at Battersea. And it cannot trouble him now, and it cannot trouble you, and there is a kind of peace in that, in how small and soft even the loudest life becomes at last against the long slow turning of the years, his triumphs and his treasons alike gone quiet, gone gentle, gone into the same still ground that takes the hero and the traitor and every one of us in the end, without judgment, without heat, only rest, and so let the last of the story loosen now and drift away like smoke from a low burning lamp, and let your shoulders drop the final small distance into the pillow, and let your breathing go slow and easy and deep. Because the tale is fully told, first breath to last, the boy on the mill wheel and the man in the snow at Quebec, and the wounded hero at Saratoga and the flight in the rowboat on the Hudson and the burning of his own coast and the grey London death and the boot of stone and the empty niche, all of it told now, all of it laid down, nothing left for you to hold or carry, and the same patient stars that turned over Norwich when Benedict Arnold was a bold and hopeful boy, and turned over the Hudson on that cold September night, and turn over Battersea now where he sleeps. Those same calm, unhurried stars are turning tonight over the roof above you, holding you as they hold him, and everyone who has ever laid down tired at the end of a long day. And there is such comfort in that, in how gently the great turning of things carries us all. So let the lamp burn low now, lower and lower, its small, warm, faithful light keeping watch over the quiet room, over you, and let go of all of it, all the way, and drift and sink, softly and easily, and without any effort at all, down into the deep warm country of sleep, where it is quiet and safe and kind, and there is nothing more to do tonight, nothing at all, only to rest. So sleep now, and rest well, and let the lamp go softly, gently out. Good night.